Is there audio now? Hurrah! I hear audio. Alright, I've only been talking for about 20 minutes to myself, I guess. Alright, can you hear me now, Andrew? Thanks for letting me know. Hopefully the audio comes through now. Just gonna talk a little bit more until I get confirmation that y'all can hear it, but I'm gonna double check on my laptop. Sounds like I can hear myself at least. Cool. So alrighty. So what I've done so far, um, all I did was generate a little skeleton game design document using Notion AI, just to give us kind of a template of what to work through, what to talk through, figure out what we're building. I guess I will do my little introduction again because I was muted or audio wasn't working, but basically this week we are going to be focusing more on brainstorming for whatever we'll be coding next week. The last couple weeks we have worked on a conversational AI sandbox for social engineering where you played as a hacker trying to infiltrate and work your way through a big old corporation by pretending to be employees that you've hacked, talking to their coworkers, convincing them to run viruses so you can then access their computers and so on. Last week we took a break, but the week before that we were working on a little strategy game for resource management and fighting over resources basically on a hex grid, which is really fun to work on. I'd only done square grids before. And then this next demo, I think what we'll do is lean more into kind of expanding the idea of that social engineering sandbox we were working on. That was basically a graphics on or no graphics, text only game of talking to a group of people. So with this new demo, we're looking to expand that more and basically give everyone a body, give everyone a space, a physical representation in a space on a small island or something. So now you can walk around to people, they have routines, they have likes and dislikes. You can incorporate more of their existence into however you play. So in the idea of a restaurant manager, you might go into town and talk to some people and learn that one person really likes this kind of fish, this person or this other person really dislikes white food. So uh, the goal of the LLM here is, or the goal of the game is basically giving players a little LLM engine that lets them say, I want to sell X, Y, and Z in my restaurant, and it'll produce the items around the island for you to create that. So giving players a lot more choice in what they're selling, how they're running their restaurant, but also giving them kind of this grounded island of people that they can interact with that will drive the decisions of how they want to run that restaurant. Hey, how's it going? Nice. Let me turn up my audio in my laptop so I can make sure I hear you as well, that it's passing your text through. Nice. So actually, I have no audio from you either. So, I mean, I hear you, but the stream does not hear you. So let me set up a audio input capture for Discord. Or actually, that's for mic. I want to set up desktop audio. Um, let's see here. Can you say something now?
Yeah, can you hear me?
There we go. Yeah, everybody can hear you now.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone.
Audio problems. All right, so yeah, basically, I've got this little game design document outline, but I think what we want to start with is just kind of a really high level like goal for the fantasy of this game.
Yeah,
Um,
so I was thinking about it a little bit,
mhm.
and it does remind me a little bit of. I think I mentioned the game Fast Food Tycoon to you
Uh-huh.
before,
Yeah.
which was called. It was called something different in Europe. I'm pretty sure it was called like Pizza Tycoon or something.
Right.
Um, but there was like a thing in there where you could make custom pizzas, and different neighborhoods had like different distributions um, of like age demographics and different preferences for ingredients and stuff.
Mhm.
Yeah. And so you could like make pizzas and they would be, different. Actually, making the pizzas was really hard. Yeah, it was like this, and you could shred up the ingredients as
That
much as
looks
you wanted to.
ridiculous. I
Yeah,
love
super
this.
ridiculous. Yeah, so I thought I would bring this up because it did remind me of this a little bit, except you could probably have more food and more ingredients and stuff. Although there were a lot of ingredients in that.
Right. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. What I was thinking beforehand is like it's a lot less it's a lot more structured than here's a pizza, put out whatever ingredients you want on it. But I think that's probably also kind of an aspect that I hadn't thought through. Like I was
Yeah.
like I would like being able to just throw whatever ingredients into a recipe you want.
hmm Yeah. So also, if you, I don't know if you can click the like main title screen. It's the third one down, all the way on the left. The image of Fast Food Tycoon.
Hmm.
Third one down, all the way on the left. Yeah. So this game also, for some reason, you could join the mafia.
Well, obviously.
There's like a whole, almost another game where you play like mafia missions and you can start your own
Interesting.
house and stuff. Yeah, it's very strange. Like disconnected from
I
the
mean,
actual restaurant.
that might be perfect though, like as an inspiration, given we can set up LLMs for like all the NPCs in town and they'll respond to whatever you want to do. So if we wanted to also have like some sort of setup where you can join the mafia and all the NPCs know that there is a mafia, I feel like I don't
Yeah.
know what that entails, but something like that could be fun in a game where you're basically coming to this island to run whatever kind of restaurant you want, however you want. If you want to run it mafia style, I guess you can.
Yeah, sounds good. So okay, that was a little bit of a detour, but if you want to get us back to
Yeah, no
the
worries.
game document.
One thing that I wanted to reiterate, I think I said it while I was muted. I don't think I hit it in the introduction. But the kind of the LLMs that we are leaning on is you say what recipe or what item you want to sell in your restaurant. For example, like fish and chips. And the goal that I'm thinking of now is that we have a prompt that breaks that down into ingredients that you need in order to make fish and chips. So, for example, like potatoes and fish. And then you also have like workstations that you would need. So, like a fryer for the potatoes to turn them into fish. So, you have this like multi step process of
Mm-hmm.
going from the player entering, I want to sell hot dogs, to generating all that stuff and placing it around the island in these systems for like fishing and farming and foraging and so
Yeah,
on.
yeah. Are we gonna, do you want to try and generate the images as well? Or,
Yeah, I think that would be cool. Um, I think what we, especially, I think that'll. I haven't decided like 2D versus 3D yet, but
uh-huh.
I feel like 2D is the obvious one if we want
Yeah,
to generate those images.
yeah.
But
The one thing that I'm wondering is like quality control on the generation, you know?
mm-hmm,
So like for performance, if we were to generate an image of a hot dog, then if we were ignoring performance, like response time,
mm-hmm,
we could have a loop where we ask then, is this a hot dog? You know? And like we have basically one AI that says yes or no, this is a quality hot dog.
yeah.
And keep sending it back for changes until it's ready. But that might be too slow for like it to be fun, you know?
Yeah, I see. I was thinking you'd ask the player, but you mean ask the another like AI, is this a hot dog?
Oh yeah, so you're saying you could just ask the player like, do you like this image?
Well, I think I like your idea better, and I think the fact that it might be too slow can be mitigated a little bit by,
Yeah.
for example, I think we want to kind of decouple the that initial ask of I want to make or I want to sell hot dogs and like the actual stuff being placed around the island because there will be a lot we want to generate. I think what we can do is have something where the player in some way says, I want to sell hot dogs, and we kick off all this generation in the back. And then, like, if you think about Stardew Valley, where you sleep each night and stuff happens like overnight,
Oh
whenever that
yeah.
generation is
Oh, I like
done,
this.
we can say, like, oh, the recipe came to you in a dream. And then the next day, all that stuff will be ready
Mm,
around the island.
mm. Yeah, the recipe comes in a dream, and like you actually have like a designer who comes to the restaurant to like
Hmm.
design what appliances you need and stuff. Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah. And one thing I just realized is, I mean, if we build this general enough, it doesn't necessarily even have to be a restaurant manager. Stop me if I immediately outscope this too far, but if you wanted to make a coffee shop, you say, I want to make coffee, and then the system generates coffee beans. It generates, I mean, whatever you need for like syrups and stuff, but that feels like it might just work if we are defining these like different systems that you can place items into and then using this
Yeah.
LLM to generate that stuff. Like it,
Yeah, so the text part of it we can do for sure. I know. Like
mm-hmm,
if it was all text, I know we
mm-hmm.
could do this today. Um
Yeah.
and like we could even generate like different types of coffee beans with like different origin stories and stuff like
Mm-hmm.
that. And we could quality control all of it with self-ask loops. But man, also generating the images and the interactions. That's going to be a challenge, but it's probably really worth tackling that challenge because I think that's probably like the next big step
Yeah.
in the libraries with what we want to do compared to like You're Not Alice, which was a step up from Smack to the Future.
Yeah. Well, one other thing I was considering um, that we probably want to build in the libraries anyway is some sort of mapping of like text to assets. So if we, for example, were to download something that has tons and tons of food icons in it, we can use that as I mean, we know that's good quality control. If if a player says like I want to serve cherry pie, we probably eventually want to build some sort of mapping that says like here's a big pool of stuff rather than generate an image for X, Y, and Z, go find the image that most matches like
Mm,
cherries and
mhm.
pies and like that's probably something good to have. I kind of saw that with You Are Not Alice where um, I was going to generate like some kind of images and stuff or file, I guess, icons. And so I was going to have like a pool of different icons the files could have, and then based on the
Mhm.
file contents, match it to an icon. But something like that
Mm,
might be a middle ground for if we want to make sure that all the images generated are like consistent style and
yeah, no, this is great. Yeah, so like start with these as a base or something.
yeah, the
Um,
only downside there is when you don't have icons for something that the player wants to sell. Like if we do all this and the player's like, I want to sell stuffed animals in my store, and we're like, okay, well you need cotton that you can grow in the farming system, and you need a workstation of a loom to turn that cotton into thread, and you need a workstation of a sewing machine. Like we can definitely do all that with text, but matching it to uh, images, maybe that's when we just fall back on like generating our own images. And
yeah, and I wonder if there's some way to tell the image gen like use this style
hmm
so like similar to these foods or something.
yeah, we probably can. We can probably like set up a model in a specific style or have like a second pass, like a style pass of it generates some cheese and then passes that as an initial image that converts it into like pixel style or something. But yeah, that's something we haven't figured out yet either.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but to keep us on track, um, for our overview, I think we want to let players have whatever kind of restaurant they want, selling whatever they want, and we want them to balance running that restaurant with like producing all of the resources to make all those items to sell. Like if you have a pie restaurant, you have to balance like actually producing all the berries and stuff to make those pies
Mm-hmm.
and like also going into town, meeting people, learning what they like, and so on. Um, and
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, I think there's lots of different AI stuff we can incorporate in this. Obviously, the recipe stuff, but also like talking to NPCs.
Mm-hmm.
If
Also, the NPCs can leave reviews on the stuff you make. I like that
yeah,
idea too.
yeah, we can give them like likes and dislikes, and they show up at your restaurant. And they're like, I don't like any of this. This restaurant sucks.
Yeah, yeah. Or maybe they really like it.
Yeah, there's maybe one NPC in town that you really, really, really like, and so you just find out everything they like and design your restaurant around them. Maybe they come every day and they'll write great reviews. Um, so other things in this generated design document, we've got objectives. All this was already generated, and I did not read any of it. We'll probably delete it, but interesting idea there that I hadn't considered is staff hiring. I guess I just assumed you'd run this restaurant yourself, but
No, it's pretty interesting to have some staff.
it
It's
could
kind
be
of
cool, yeah.
like a next level of interaction with like the villagers in Animal Crossing or something.
hmm Yeah, I mean, if you built like a little coffee shop or a restaurant or something where it started getting popular, obviously the if you're running it yourself, that gets more and more difficult as you have more orders, but you also need more time to do all that farming and stuff. So staff might be a natural approach to like now you're more in manager mode, designing the store instead of running it yourself. Um, could be cool.
Yeah, for sure. There's also the idea of being able to build golems to help you with stuff.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's kind of the opposite side of the coin of like, do you want to, if you have this restaurant that's popping off, do you want to spend more time working in the restaurant or do you want to spend more time like farming and stuff? If you want to spend more time working in the restaurant, you get your golems that work the fields and do fishing and stuff like that. Or I guess you could just make golems that work in the restaurant too, if you want to be the one farming.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, it's a good idea. I'm trying to imagine how. So, do you think we'll have some like code generation underneath it that will like generate interactions? Do you know what I mean? Like,
what do you mean by
okay,
interactions?
so like, okay, you've generated all this stuff for berry farming, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
and you go to do it.
Right.
Like, when you walk up to water it, is that interaction gonna be
Mm.
somehow generated? You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think we can. I think the two approaches we could do is one is more that like quality control railroading of like we can define that farming stuff has either plants, bushes, or trees, and then map like items into that. So the functionality for growing a bush is defined, like how to water it and stuff, but
Yeah,
the
yeah.
system provides like, oh, this is the kind of bush and the speed it grows at and like what it produces and how often and so
Okay,
on.
yeah. Yeah,
I
I
th-
like that. So it's not completely open, but like as close as we can get just to make it playable.
yeah, I think that's easiest. It would be really cool to generate some of those interactions, and maybe we can. Um, Obviously, the downside of the hard-coded stuff is if you try and come up with stuff that doesn't fit in that model. And obviously, that's really hard to plan against because it can be
Yeah,
anything.
yeah.
Um,
I think generating the animations would be a real challenge too.
hmm. Yeah, that's true.
Mm.
Yeah,
But
there's a lot of like um, kind of second order stuff that we'd also have to generate, like sound
yeah,
effects and
yeah, I'm
stuff
probably
like that.
getting too much into the details, but like the idea of generating the process and the images, I think is a good step forward for sure.
Hmm. Okay, cool. Um, well, let's call this MVP, and let's try and break down to planning out just like this core. You generate the items, you produce the items, you sell them in your restaurant, or you like craft them into the recipes. So, um,
Sounds good. I'm gonna step away for like 10 seconds.
no
Well, a little
worries.
longer. I need to use the restroom. I'll be right back.
No worries. All right, so objectives for this game. We want to provide players with a way to sell whatever they want in their restaurant by generating items, by generating resources, crafting stations, and processes based on recipe names. So that's our primary thing that we are looking to do. We'll skip staff stuff for now. We'll skip like customizing the restaurant with furniture and stuff. I think that's going to be a given later. But that core system, we want to also provide support multiple ways to produce each resource outside of the restaurant farming, fishing, foraging, markets, etc. And then finally, we want to um, simulate a cozy life sim on an island where the player manages friendships with NPCs that occasionally visit their restaurant. So I think that's the core, like, what we want to build here. Before we get into mechanics and systems, I'm gonna start on a simple, like, game loop. Player visits, we'll say, each day the player can choose, each day the player can choose from the following activities. We'll have like limited time in the day or limited energy in the day or whatever we want to do to maintain their. So we want managing the restaurant, taking orders, making orders. Somebody, if you think of whatever that popular cooking game is where you're running around in the kitchen, you got to get this ingredient, take it here. That could be fun, or you could set up like little golem sous chefs that do a lot of the prep for you and simplify it. Not sure yet how we want to do that actual gameplay there, but that's going to be kind of one half of this whole managing restaurant. Visiting and conversing with NPCs around town. And we can give them like daily quests, and they're like, hey, I need some grapes. Can you bring me some grapes? Or,
Hey, sorry about that. I'm back.
no worries. I threw together some objectives that's just kind of the core, like, you want to run a restaurant with these items, we'll generate the items, and it's a little life sim.
Okay, looks good. I guess we could also put like a technical challenges
Yeah.
section, like just below that or something.
Let,
Maybe it's already on there.
let's do
Because
it.
that's just where my mind is jumping to, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But,
Yeah, let's wrap up this game loop section of just like what all you can do each day, like
mhm.
what's begging for your time. So you got obviously managing the restaurant, you got talking to NPCs around town, and you've got like harvesting resources. Is there anything else that like a player might want to do throughout the day?
So let's see. Taking orders, making orders. Oh yeah, it feels like there could be some other stuff, right? Like there could
Right.
be, but maybe you're including that in visiting with other NPCs.
Yeah, like the NPCs could have like little jobs or tasks that's like, hey, I need you to make me some grapes, or like my fishing rod broke, can you bring me a new one? That sort of stuff.
Yeah, so one thing that like Harvest Moon on the Nintendo 64, there was
Mm-hmm.
like a whole adventure that you could
Mm-hmm.
do, like digging down into that cave or whatever.
Uh-huh.
I feel like Stardew Valley alludes to it a little bit, but it's not quite as like mystical.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and it's the same kind of thing as like in Fast Food Tycoon, you can randomly be in the mafia. I just feel like
Right. Some sort of like more actiony. Like, it's probably really good for managing the pace of the game instead of just like farming every day.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the like,
Well, also, I think the other thing to think about too is um, how active, like managing the restaurant, how actively do you want to be managing it? Like, is
right.
your player literally going to go walk and take an order, go back, make it? Or is it going to
Hmm.
be more like kind of in Fast Food Tycoon, you set up the restaurant, you set up the menu, and you set up the amount of staff, but then it just kind of happens. Like, it's more of like a simulation, I guess.
Right.
So then it's like, okay, are you playing like Overcooked in the kitchen, kind of? Or...
Overcooked is the game I was trying to think of. Yeah, I
Mm-hmm.
think if it is more like Overcooked, I think that probably fills that like action-based
Yeah, for
thing,
sure.
like the night and day. You go from that to like
Yeah,
farming.
yeah,
But if you don't want to play Overcooked, maybe that's when you like set up some golems that are like either sous chefs that prep stuff for you or they like fully run the restaurant for you. And if that's the case, maybe we do need some sort of actiony option outside of that.
yeah. I don't know if we necessarily need it. It's just something that I'm thinking about. Like I'm wondering what else. Because I
Hmm.
guess the other really fun thing in those games like Stardew Valley and stuff is that you're constantly working towards like making your house bigger, making your farm bigger, like getting more equipment, that
Yeah,
kind of stuff. Um,
yeah, that's a good point. And also, I mean, it might make sense if we're talking about like these resource systems. Like, there's probably stuff that requires rocks or stones, like for furniture or something. Maybe it just makes sense that one of those systems is a cave that you can go in.
yeah.
And if you want to produce like rock pie or something, maybe that's where we make like little rocks in the cave that they just get placed there every day and you got to go down and mine them. And it's
Yeah,
just like one of these systems.
I'm also laughing because I'm just thinking about how open it can be. Like, what if you just say, "Okay, I want to like drill for oil," like,
Right? Uh-huh. It's like I want to sell the legs of the NPCs in town. I don't know.
terrible. That's
I
like a
serial
that's like
killer manager.
rimworld.
Right.
That's
So,
like the organ harvesting, right?
y-
In rimworld.
yeah, I actually was about to play what's it, Graveyard Tycoon? What's the name of this new graveyard keeper? You run a graveyard and people like deliver you bodies and you
Wait,
decide.
is this new? Is this new?
I think it came out last year. I was
Is
watching
it
some less.
possible to play this co-op?
Uh,
Because maybe we should give it a try.
that would be fun if it is. If it's not, I'll play it single player. Let's see, single player. No co-op,
Dang, bummer.
but it looks pretty sweet. I just haven't played it. It's got like tons of stuff to do.
Yeah, it's a real twist. I like
Mm-hmm.
how the aesthetic of it though is sort of like Stardew Valley type thing,
Right, right.
but you're a gravekeeper. Oh, and then you're like adventuring. Interesting.
Mm-hmm. So it's like a ethical dilemmas, questionable decisions. I think it's like you can either bury the bodies or like steal organs and sell the organs and so on. But
Mm.
yeah, the open-endedness of this will be really fun to test out.
Yeah, yeah. And and it's just I feel like the hardest part with it is just gonna be how do you make it not feel the same whatever you choose since it's generated. You know what I mean?
Yeah, like if
Like
you,
how do you make it feel materially different if you choose to like just drill for oil all over the island
uh-huh,
compared to like make a sustainable like fish restaurant
right.
or something? You know, how do you make it feel like you're doing something really different?
Mm-hmm. And I think, yeah, like if you want to do a vegetarian restaurant, most likely you're just going to be like farming and you just have like different ingredients. And if they're all just generated like the same process but produces different items. I
Yeah,
mean,
because I I was uh I was listening to a thing about this actually with using like games that use procedural generation versus games that are fully designed, right?
hmm yeah,
Um, One of the pitfalls of procedural generation is that even though every level is technically different, it can start to feel like each level is just the same,
yeah,
like because it's been generated. Where like when a whole game is designed, you kind of know everywhere you go is going to have its own unique like meanings and stuff and like impacts and everything.
right.
So I think for us, that's like something to really think about how can we capture that feel of like, oh, the oil drilling experience is designed, even though it's actually generated. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm gonna add that to our technical challenges section because
Or like,
that's a great point.
yeah, yeah, because that's the thing. Like, what was the game? What was the game? No Man's Sky. You remember
hmm
that one?
Oh yeah.
That was like the problem that everybody had with that game when it came out. Although I've heard it's gotten a lot better, but the problem that people had with that game when it came out was yes, technically there were like millions and millions of planets, and technically everyone you went to was different in some way,
hmm
but they felt very similar and not meaningfully different because they were just generated by the same sort of like procedural generation.
Right,
So
right.
you were landing on different planets, but it was like, okay, what's really different here? You know?
Yeah, that's a good point. Like you land on a new planet and it's animals are walking around, they might kill you, but some of them are bigger, some of them are smaller, some of them are
Right,
green.
right.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Where on the other hand, in a game like Skyrim, everywhere you go has been like designed, you know,
hmm
and there's some kind of thing going on everywhere you go. That's like a little different.
Yeah. Yeah, there's probably a lot of ways to tackle or like mitigate that a little bit. We probably want to think through more of them, but my first inclination is like keeping the scope small. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
and also trying to make those procedurally generated systems as small and layered as possible. So,
yeah.
like, rather
Well,
than
and
go on, sorry.
I mean the thing that we have now that's different is we can do a self-ask loop
Mm-hmm.
with like a GPT or some similar model,
Right.
and we can. It's almost like okay, that GPT is like designing a specific experience, you know, and you can loop and say like how unique is this compared to others. So
Yeah.
if we're delaying, like you're saying, like delaying with some stuff going on while you generate in the background,
Mm-hmm.
that's the thing that we have now that like it even a year ago we wouldn't have had.
Yeah,
Or
true.
I guess like about a year ago we would have started to have. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think that's something we'll probably want to keep in mind as a question as we are designing stuff, and
Yeah.
probably something we can't answer until we have what
Yeah.
we're actually going to design.
Yeah, I guess I'm kind of getting us off topic on this, but it's the main thing that I think about because I think that's the biggest question for us ultimately. Like, are we going to be able to build a really cool game using this? Is like, can we capture that feel of,
Right.
hey, it's not it's generated, but it feels like it's designed, you know,
hmm
also, which is cool.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of when we were like pitching the idea for the studio originally.
Hmm.
People were
Hmm.
always like, "Oh yeah, in an MMO, like you can have NPCs say like they have quests generated of like go kill 20 wolves, go
Right,
kill whatever." And that's
right.
like it doesn't matter if it's generated. That's just the same if you're
Yeah.
killing 20 wolves or 20 turtles. It gets a little
Well,
cooler when people are like, "Oh, this town is overrun by wolves." And that's what like feeds into the quest of like, "Okay, you need to go cull some
yeah.
wolves." But it's
Well,
still
you
the
know,
same.
MMOs like WoW is a great example that people will put up with a lot of redundancy if
True.
there is like really good payoff at the end.
Mhm.
You know, because questing and WoW. So some people love it. Some people love it. So I don't want
Mm-hmm.
to like say those people are wrong. But like for
Right.
me, when I was doing questing and WoW to level my guy up, I was never like, oh, I'm enjoying the quest. I was like, I'm trying to get max level so I can do the like the raids and the dungeons that are like collaborative, and those were like a huge payoff to be able to do. And
Mm-hmm.
to me, the quests were always like, okay, I'm either gathering something or killing something, and that's pretty much it. There's like
Right.
two quests basically, and you do them like literally 5,000 of them or something ridiculous.
Right. Yeah, I mean that's kind of you can tie that back to what we were talking about with like do you generate interactions or do you like assign to the system because it'd be really easy to have like some quest templates of go kill something, go collect something and then just like generate those, which is not that fun. But
Yeah,
if you could generate the interactions, then maybe it's like this person actually wants you to I don't know, go convince somebody else that they um, deserve a job at this other place. And if you
yeah,
are
like
able to do
actually,
that, like,
and you have to talk to an AI agent. Yeah, that's a
hmm
crazy idea.
yeah, or
Yeah,
like,
because in Skyrim you get some stuff that's a little like that. Like, okay,
hmm
hey, go gather this, but then use your alchemy skill to make this and take it back.
right,
But still, at the same time, it's like it feels functionally the same as like a gathering quest. So
yeah,
yeah, like I think conversational quest. That's a really interesting idea. That's like that's cool. That's really
hmm
cool.
because I think also if the way that you're completing the quest if it's done through like that conversational AI, you inherently have a lot of different ways you could do it. It's not just like
Hmm.
go kill some wolves. It's like, are you going to be really nice and like try and convince somebody of
Mm,
something through that? Are you going to like intimidate them because you're in the mafia? Are you going to
yeah, yeah.
trick them? Like if
Mm,
you maybe an NPC is having a birthday, so their quest is like go convince 20 other
hmm
NPCs to come to my party. It's like
hmm
now you
It reminds me. Sorry to interrupt. It reminds me a bit of Mass Effect. Did you ever play that game?
no.
Oh man, yeah, it's a little bit like that. Where if you have your skills up to a certain level in like intimidation or persuasion or stuff, there's certain like
hmm
paths you can take in the story that aren't there for you otherwise. So this is like a next level of that where the AI could be taking in your character's skills and those things and also
hmm
what you're choosing to say. Just like the cop in Smack to the Future.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. That's actually a very similar system to how Baldur's Gate does it. But in Mass Effect, is it like if you have 15 intimidation, you're successful, and if you have less than that, you can't do it?
Um Yeah, I'm trying to remember if it's always like that. So when you get to the actual part where you make that choice, that's
hmm
usually what it is. It's like if you have a certain amount of this or that, you'll be successful in it.
Gotcha.
But getting to the choice sometimes is about making correct decisions, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that
And
makes
not about
sense.
your character's skill. Like you have to be trying to get to even have the option to do that.
Gotcha. Yeah, it sounds very similar. I think the only difference is like a little bit of RNG in Baldur's Gate.
Hmm.
Like your skill level it determines how high you need to roll on a dice
Mm.
roll.
Yeah,
So like
yeah.
if you try and intimidate somebody, you can it's easier if you have higher intimidation, but you still can if
Hmm.
you're lower. But I
Yeah,
like
I
that a
mean,
lot.
Mass Effect just like generations ahead of its time, like
Yeah, yeah,
truly.
for sure. Sounds like it. Um, do we want to have a little section for like technical systems that we can build into this game?
Yeah,
Um,
I guess we could include that in technical challenges, really, if we want,
yeah,
or we could have a different one. It's up to you.
let's make it a separate section just so we can be more in depth on each of the systems. And I mean, this might be nice for like divvying up who wants to build what and what not later too. Um, but for example, all of the like uh, restaurant systems that we can flesh out the resource systems and the NPC systems. So, like farming, fishing, mining, foraging, and so on. Uh, I see each of these being like independent uh,
Mm-hmm.
activities. So, I mean, did you ever play Stardew Valley?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So when you go fishing, you got like a little mini game. Maybe we build some sort of mini game for fishing.
Mm-hmm.
We can do mini games for whatever we want, but like farming obviously has a lot of systems in it. The restaurant
Yeah.
systems we want to
Should we
have.
have some kind of like industry or like crafting?
Yeah, yeah. So actually, yeah, crafting. We might be able to reuse the same system for like how you're. Well,
Heavy industry, if you're
we probably do want like. I mean, industry definitely sounds pretty hardcore, but if you are, you probably do want a system for crafting like pickaxes and fishing rods and stuff. So if, for example, you get you put in an item that requires you to catch a fish and also farm for stuff. If we haven't generated fishing rods yet, or we haven't generated like the farming tools, part of that generation process for everything needed to produce that item should probably generate the tools, their crafting recipes, and so on. Um, but we could also just hard code a bunch of tools too. Um, We want to figure out how we'll do cooking. I don't know if we want to go like full on overcooked or just make it like Minecraft style cooking recipes, like basically the
Yeah.
crafting grid. But cooking is a system we'll want to figure out.
Yeah, and it's kind of one of those things where I think if we want to make the cooking like really in depth,
Mm-hmm.
then maybe we rein in the scope on the rest of it a little bit
Mm-hmm.
and focus on the generation, like generating the interactions there. But if we want the cooking to be like it's more like you set the menu and it just kind of happens or something,
Right. Yeah,
then the
like
rest of it could be a little more expanded.
yeah, it could be even like you just designate the inventory for the day. Actually, the single idea that spawned this whole game was just the idea of like in Stardew Valley, you're like, hey, I have a lot of turtles or a lot of fish today, so I'm gonna do a little restaurant with a today's special is fish soup. And so you like walk on down and put a little sign down saying today's special is this, and then people come for that item because you have a lot of it. And uh,
Yeah, yeah.
so the actual like cooking process is, I know it's fun to a lot of people. I usually don't do a lot of cooking games per se, but like we could also do something more like Factorio style where you set up automation for all the cooking and it just runs through the day. Um,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but
Yeah,
yeah,
I mean, I think that's going to be a key decision. I don't know which one is right
right.
exactly, but
Yeah, that's probably a very core system to figure out. Maybe we
mm-hmm.
can talk to some people who like cooking games and some people who would love to see cooking in like Stardew Valley, like how they would implement it into Stardew Valley. Maybe actually we look at like mods for similar games and see if anybody adds like cooking or something and see how they did it. Might be an interesting way to kind of get that feedback on what people are looking for. For NPCs, I think we'll want like some sort of friendship system. Just if you give them items they like you more. What do you get out of a higher friendship? I don't know. Maybe that's more like when you talked about in WoW, you kind of do that redundant grind to get to the interesting, cool stuff that feels more designed.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe friendship points gets you like those Stardew Valley-esque cutscenes that are more designed, and it's just like the giving them of items that they like is more of that redundant grind.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting to think about because like in WoW, definitely, like the first time you play it, there is some like payoff to the questing part that's beyond just leveling up,
Hmm.
which is like you see this crazy world, right?
Yeah,
You like see this crazy world and like experience it, but functionally the quests are just all the same.
right.
Yeah.
But you're also getting like plot through the quests, which is also really
Well,
hard. Well,
if you're
theoretically.
reading them at all.
Yeah. That's fair. That's fair. I think I was the only one who played through all the Diablo games and read the dialogue.
Yeah, you might just
Everybody
be.
else just clicks through.
You might just be.
Um, so here's a question for you. Um, let's see, recipe generation is what I'm gonna ask about. You are playing a game. You want, your intention is to say, I want to sell all beef hot dogs at my restaurant.
Hmm.
Where where do you go to do that? Like in the game? Do you have like a dream journal? Do you have like a research bench? Do you have like a person in town you go talk to and ask like how do I do this?
Mm.
Like where does that fit in the game? And also we can talk more about like input systems like keyboard and mouse versus uh, keyboard only, blah blah blah. But
Hmm.
do you just like type in hot dogs or like all beef hot dogs?
Yeah, and then you have to ask yourself, like, what happens if they type just like nonsense? You
Right.
know,
They
like
type
something
in
that's
this.
not a
I want
thing.
to sell that. What does it generate?
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
like,
exactly.
yeah, there's that
So,
open-ended. Oh, go on. Sorry, I don't want to keep piling on more questions.
well, I think the dream is a good idea. I think maybe like a chamber of commerce is a funny idea
Uh huh.
as well. And they'll like, okay, we'll commission you a report
That's
on
a good
how to do
idea.
it or something, or like we'll send our people to you.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so one of those seems good, I guess. The or like you could sit down and write about what you want to do, and then in the dream, the
Mm-hmm.
stuff comes to you later.
Yeah.
Um, hmm. And then as far as quality control, I mean, there's always just the self ask to like, hey, is this an item that would be served in a restaurant? But
That's
then you're
true.
running the risk of like, what if the AI just doesn't know some
Mm-hmm.
item, you know?
Or what if the AI is too restrictive and says, no, you can't serve raw oil in your restaurant?
Yeah, right. Like you can't serve something. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So that's definitely a challenge there.
Yeah. So here's some pretty, I think these are like the core systems. We might be able to get away with skipping like crafting if we hard code in a bunch of tools and items and stuff, but it's probably worth having because I think it'll be a good system that we can use from the LLM. Like, if you have something that requires bread, you can generate the crafting recipes of like flour to or wheat to flour, flour to bread, bread to whatever your item is. Um, Obviously, there's a lot of other systems like player movement and
Hmm.
inventory and all that jazz, but I think these are
Hmm.
like the core. I think maybe we also add like a Saturday market for things as just like a catch-all. If you say I want to serve pies that have little ballerina figurines in them,
Hmm.
obviously you're not going to make little ballerina figurines, but maybe like every Saturday there's a pool of those sorts of items that have been generated and they sell some random selection of them. So you can
Yeah,
have like a
makes sense.
special of that item, and if you can't get it anywhere else, you just get it from that. Nice little catch-all. Thinking about the NPCs, obviously talking to them, we can kind of reuse the "You are not Alice" systems pretty easily. Um,
Hmm.
I started building like a trust system in that, but I think we want to abstract that out and build like a friendship system. Um, we could do some sort of like requests and tasks
Maybe we
system.
could even call it a relationship system.
Yeah, let's
So
do
then
that.
it's like you can have friends and enemies and
Yeah, actually, I like that.
frenemies. Yeah.
And they can all have relationships to each other too. So maybe somebody's quest is to mend a broken friendship between
Hmm.
two enemies. Um, I mean, just these would be pretty intense game, pretty fun to play.
Yeah, yeah. I
Like,
mean,
I feel like
for
all of
sure.
these we can kind of a lot of the processes will be reused. It'll just be different like animations and maybe like mini
Okay,
games.
one more thought.
Hmm.
Um, I think another big challenge will be um, how to like let someone progress at the thing they've chosen to do. Does that make sense?
Yeah, like if somebody is fishing a lot, they want to get better at fishing.
Yeah, or like, okay, let's say that you're serving pies, right?
Hmm.
How do you like level up over time, like to serve better and better pies?
Right.
Obviously you like learn the tendencies of the NPCs and stuff, but is there a
Hmm.
way for you to like you start out and you're hand making all the pies, and then later you're able to somehow build a machine that like lets you also sell frozen versions of your pie or whatever?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that could be interesting to think about because always in Stardew Valley or Harvest Moon or something, you're always working to like build onto your house, add on to it.
Right. Yeah, and I think even at a lower level, you probably, even if you just continuously make pies by scratch, like obviously you're going to get better at making pies the more you do it. Um,
Yeah, for sure.
and that could be like you have a cooking skill and like all of your items or all of your things that you cook get better as your cooking skill gets better and you do like a Stardew Valley-esque like
Man,
silver star, gold star, purple star.
it's interesting if the skill tree is generated based on what you want to do.
Hmm.
That's like interesting too. I don't know if it would work, but it's something to think about, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I have always wanted to make a game that is basically the RuneScape skills in another game because it's such a good system, I would say. Like, really good progression, and you don't have to do like combat. You can just choose to be like
Hmm.
a blacksmith or a miner or whatever, and you just
Yeah,
progress through that.
or a scammer.
Right, right. I mean,
The number one job for mid 2000s RuneScape players.
right. Yeah, let me trim your armor real fast.
Yeah,
Um,
hey, let me help you out, buddy. You want to
just
see the wilderness?
yeah, if you want to dupe that item, just drop it and walk away, and I definitely won't telegrab it.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
No, I know what you mean because the skills. It is a great set of skills, and it's a great world. But the gameplay is just like,
it's so old
yeah,
now,
yeah.
but we could have skills for like cooking, farming, fishing, mining, etc. And when we generate, like, if you say I want to sell shepherd's pie, we could have skill requirements for like some of the ingredients of like,
Hmm.
oh, in order to make potatoes, you only need level 1. To
Hmm.
mash potatoes, you need level 5 cooking or whatever. And we
Hmm.
can bake that into the LLM generation. Um,
Yeah, where it can like assign. So yeah, I think yeah, the hardest part about it will be making sure that you get like a good progression,
right.
because I feel like that's hard.
Yeah.
Where it's like, what if it just gives you cherry pie like right at the beginning, and then at the end it's like, okay, I don't know, you can make something that you don't care about making.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, it's simpler, way simpler approach is just like you have your cooking skill that's like 1 through 10, and every level increases like the value of your pie by 10% or something. I mean, that's kind of
Hmm.
boring, but it does have the progression that's
Oh man,
constant.
I do like the idea of like challenging ourselves to build the generated progression that because that
Hmm.
seems like that could be a really cool library for future games too.
I agree. And I think it would be very,
Level
very
100 industry, you can build the offshore oil platform.
perfect. I think it would also be really fun to challenge ourselves one step further to say, generate the skill itself
Uh-huh.
and
Yeah.
say, oh, we haven't added hunting to the game yet, but
Mm-hmm.
this skill requires you to, or this recipe that you're building requires you to have wolf pelts. So therefore, we generate the
Yeah.
hunting skill, which
So
lets you.
okay, so almost what we're talking about is behind the scenes like a set of agents that almost accomplish like a very small part of game dev themselves.
Hmm. Yeah.
You know, like given the prompt, like, hey, I would like to hunt or I would like to drill for oil, they kind of like make a game in a way.
Hmm. I mean,
Yeah.
those would be good systems for us to have for future
Oh, for
demos
sure.
too.
For sure. It reminds me of, oh man, what, no, I know I linked this in the Discord. I'll have to go find the GitHub again. But it's like,
Hmm.
yeah, someone basically did this like setup. Hey, this is like if a bunch of GPTs were a company and their functions are like broken down in this way.
Right.
Let me find it real quick.
Alrighty. I'm going to try and write out some of these progression systems that we had talked about while you look. Um, as an Irishman, my innate sense of when somebody was talking about potatoes went off. So Jason thought he'd come see what we were up to. We are making a game where you can sell nothing but potatoes if
Oh
you want.
man, yeah, yeah, it would be great to get your thoughts on some of this stuff, Jason, for sure.
Yeah, if you're just joining, we're basically just brainstorming kind of the system where in a game you're running a restaurant and the very high level is you're capable of saying, I want to sell blank. I want to sell shepherd's pie, I want to sell animal plushies, I want to sell coffee, and then we take that and pass it through a series of LLMs that breaks it down into the ingredients that you need, the processes to produce those ingredients, the processes to refine those ingredients into like potatoes to mashed potatoes, that sort of thing, and also like the cooking recipes to produce your shepherd's pie in the end, or however you want to do. So um, just a little life sim where you can kind of create a shop or a restaurant or whatever you want. We're defining some systems that will be able to allocate items into. Um, so if you need potatoes for a recipe that you want to produce, then we will generate potatoes as an item, put that in that farming system, put some potato seeds around the island somewhere for you to find, and so on, or give them to like a market passing through, something like that. Um, Trying to keep it very open ended. So you could say like, I want to, I don't know, raise livestock. Andrew, I think your link got censored in the chat, but you can drop it in Discord and it'll pull it up on stream.
Oh, okay, okay. This is just the link that I was looking for. Um, and there's a paper to go along with it too.
Cool.
Um, yeah, 1 second.
No worries.
Okay, I just put it in general,
Nice.
and then the paper that goes with it is here.
What have we got here?
Yeah, super interesting paper, and GitHub. It's basically the idea of setting up AI agents in the way. So, like, think of the collection of AI agents as a company instead of each one as as like a person.
Mm-hmm.
So then you can like break up the functions, and sometimes you can have a set of agents that would accomplish the goal of like one person,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. They can
Yeah, and
work
they use this
towards.
to like build games from scratch, like known games like Pong and stuff in the paper, I'm pretty sure, which is super
Interesting.
interesting.
Oh, so
Anyway,
they use this to like produce. They generate code from all these agents that like
yeah,
works together. I see.
yeah, so it's like a company, and you tell the boss like, "Hey, make me Pong," and then like,
Mm-hmm.
and then here it is.
I mean, that would be super cool.
Yeah, yeah.
Wow. Jason says they made a game in 6 minutes from the start. I mean, maybe we can use something like this for eventually when we want to have like people hired in the restaurant. If you just say run the restaurant, you got the cashier, the chefs, the blah blah blah. Um, so you want to sell dragon toenails, the famous aphrodisiac, to yak farmers to increase the meat options for my local diner. I think you'd be able to do that. Um, maybe you maybe we produce dragons around town. One resource system that I think we are missing is like anything animal related. Um, I don't know how logically it makes sense for animals to start showing up on the island, but maybe they just migrate there. But we probably
Yeah, or
do
maybe you
want,
have to get them imported. Maybe.
yeah, like pay to have them imported, or like you probably want some sort of ranching function if you want to raise dragons for harvesting those toenails every week. Um, so one thing I was thinking about doing on stream is just kind of prototyping some system messages to see if we could get like a dragon toenail aphrodisiac get broken down
Like
into like a
supply
list of
chain.
ingredients. Yeah, like supply
Hmm.
chain. Uh, so maybe I'll type something up if you let's see your knowledge for a
Yeah, and while
new.
while he's typing that, I guess I would say that this to us is like a natural progression of the work we did in the first two demos that we have. Like so far we started by including an AI agent within a game that had to make a decision based on the game state in communication with the player, um, that affected the outcome of the game. And then Andrew did a lot of um, oh yeah, Jason, if you want to join voice chat uh, in the Discord, please like join and talk with us. You're more than welcome to join us.
I didn't want to interrupt
Oh
unless
yeah, appreciate it.
your important conversations.
Oh yeah. I usually join the streaming voice channel when I stream. Sometimes I don't because nobody ever joins, but yeah, you're always welcome to pop in.
Cool. Well, I guess to start, here's my just broad question. I love researching games, game design as a concept, more so than the specific details. And what fascinates me is the kind of holistic definition of what a game is. And so I guess my broad question, um, I'm somebody who I'm not super sold on AI in games. I like AI, I like games, but the intersection to me leads to an interesting question, which is kind of what I'm leading to, which is what is the end goal and where does this fit in with the conceptual concept of what a game is? Because broadly to me, the definition between works, like you can say it's work in a game and the work is building towards an outcome, and then a game is an outcome without the specific purpose or goal. It's more for fun. But I guess the point is when you get into games that effectively play themselves or that are systemically building,
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
where's the game portion of the game effectively?
Man,
You know?
yeah, it's a huge question, right? And actually, earlier in the stream, we were kind of having this discussion that one of the issues with procedural generation in games now, and I use the example of No Man's Sky when it came out. Did you ever play that?
I did. I played it back when it was bad, and then I played it afterwards when it was good.
Yeah, it's supposed to be good now. I haven't played it since it became good, but when it first came out, the problem that people had with it is that every planet was technically different since it was procedurally generated, but it didn't feel meaningfully different. You know, it was essentially the same no matter what planet you landed on. And so the question that we've been asking ourselves and challenging ourselves with using a specific design function that uses LLMs called React and also another pattern called self-ask is, can we fix that problem? Can we make things that are procedurally generated but feel meaningfully designed? So I think that's a capability that's only been possible within maybe the last year, like since ChatGPT is like the big breakthrough that kind of allows that. I guess I've kind of gotten off topic on your question, but the big question is, yeah, can we create games that feel meaningful on the gameplay level, but have
Because
more expansive content? You know?
yeah, because I guess so I don't disagree that it's feasibly possible to make something using LLMs or similar that feels meaningfully designed. But meaningfully designed doesn't directly correlate with compelling as a gameplay, right? And so the question is, how do you define compelling for gameplay? I'm a big fan of self-determination theory as a driving force for that. So broadly speaking, why do people do anything? Well, it's motivation. That's the driving factor for anything. Like if you put someone in a game and there's nothing good in front of them, nothing bad behind them, and no rewards for movement, standing still is an equally as viable strategy as anything else because
Yeah.
conceptually you've provided no value not to. And so when you break this up into um, the types of players and the different categories, like people go into really big detail about who chooses what types of games for why, but I think all of that is downstream. The fundamental matter is someone motivated to keep engaging? Whether they engage for
Mhm.
good reasons or bad reasons is relevant, and which particular things. But if we're talking about a system, what is the public facing features that make a system compelling?
Mhm.
And the motivation aspect basically boils down to the three concepts is one, a feeling of autonomy. So do I feel like I actually have agency? If not, there's no point in doing anything because my decisions don't matter. Competence is that general concept of mastery. If I feel like I'm being beaten down the whole time, there's no reason to do it. And if I feel like it's playing itself effectively, there's no reason to do it either. So one, I need to feel like I have choices, and two, those choices have to be competently mattering in some capacity. And the
Yeah.
third one tends to be relatedness, which is in some capacity this needs to expand beyond me. If I do this in a bubble and it goes nowhere and does nothing, then there's no reason for me to do it. So can I either
Mhm.
share the outcomes? Can other people engage with it? Can I be proud of it in some capacity for when I'm done? And so all of this is to say, if motivation, in my opinion, is the driving factor, a lot of these systems are effectively perpetual motion machines. And if you're telling the player you can poke the spokes of this particular perpetual motion machine, that's cool, but where does that fit into these three pillars of autonomy, competence, and relatedness? And how do people engage with it in a way where they feel like it's a satisfying use of their time?
Yeah, so we were also talking about this as it relates to cozy games earlier. So, like Harvest Moon or Stardew Valley or something, you're always constantly working to like improve your lot, like meet big goals. Like the motivation is to improve the farm, like buy a barn, like big progression. And so one of the technical challenges of like letting someone say they want to sell anything and then generating the supply chain is, can you also generate a progression system that feels meaningful? And I think that it's super difficult, but maybe not impossible. I'm not sure. What do you think?
My driving thing, my actually the reason I play games, which is usually the contrasting point, is I play games for narrative. I don't play games for any other reason. And as weird as that sounds, I still like procedural generated games, but I play them for narrative reasons, which throws people because I'm not talking about the narrative of the protagonist. I'm talking about the narrative of the Irish dude who sits down and picks up a controller, right? The narrative I have is somebody who sits down and I engage with the system and I am choosing who I am before I sit down, and then I become someone else when I step away from that machine. Either I'm someone who's more competent, I'm somebody who's happier, I'm someone who's sadder, I'm someone who learned something, whatever that narrative is. And I find that a game which gives me a hero arc, traditionally the sort of Dan Harmon-esque story circle, where I enter with a status quo. Something happens in the game which challenges my expectations, whether it's a difficulty curve that's too high, whether it's a narrative arc of something I don't expect, whether it's embodying a character I'm not normally like, and then I go through an arc, and then by the end of it achieve something, is the compelling narrative structure. And so, to me, I think systems, whether they're procedural or not, is the Lego blocks to engage with the problem. But the real problem is you need to have a narrative arc. You need to have an actual story structure from start to finish. And the number one defining factor of a good story structure is a break of status quo. It's the implication that the world is X, but then. The really good version of this, which I think sums this up really nicely, is the South Park team, because they talk about their absolutely insane story writing. And I think more than anybody else, they've pretty much demonstrated how you can go completely off the rails on unrelated concepts and tie it to a cohesive story.
Yeah,
Whether you agree it's good or whatever is irrelevant, but the fact is, I've never seen another group successfully do and then it all ties together. It's like, how did they do it? Well, they tell you how they do it. They do it if, but, or therefore. That's their entire like writing philosophy. They say a lot of people write stuff by just making either moments or scenes or something. Every idea, no matter how outlandish it is, has to be a but this happened. Therefore, we do this. But that happened. Therefore, this occurred. And so this like stitching together of yes-anding through things is what leads to a compelling story. They've done talks on this, which is really cool. Yeah, so all of this is the same. My kind of thesis of the idea is you can generate as much as you like. That's fine. And generation's good. But if the subtextual narrative of the player playing your game is, oh, this is procedural, how can I mess with it? That's what they're going to think, right? How can I break this in some compelling or interesting way? Which isn't really what you want if your goal, unless your goal is literally to have a pseudo narrative which contrasts that with the player and like chastises them for it or something. If your goal is to actually make a game which systemically does those things, you have to disincentivize that behavior and incentivize the behavior you want. And the way you would do that is you would structure a new narrative where they have a different objective. It's the classic thing of people will stop infighting if they have a shared villain. And so if your narrative is you want people to engage with building their farm or building a system or something, you need a larger systemic problem. You need to have them play the game and start with the in-game universe is being destroyed, or all of the crops are dying, or the god of the universe themselves are destroying everything, and you have to remanufacture the concepts of trade from ground principles. And so it's not just playing for playing's sake. There is stakes you've injected into the story that is guiding them on a structured narrative that leads towards a goal that's a through line, which is building up rather than tearing down.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point. So do you think that that if you could combine like a meta narrative, so for example in Stardew Valley you're taking over the farm because your grandfather passed away or something. It's been a while since I played that, so if that's wrong, it's something like that. I know it is. So if you could have some kind of narrative like that where, hey, you're coming to this island, your family used to live here, and they need you to start a business or something, and it's just super open-ended like that. And a lot of the yes and story can actually come from emergent behavior of the AI agents in the game. do you think that leads to something really compelling where each time you want to play, you can play it totally differently, different industry, but similar like meta narrative? I mean, is that interesting to you, or what's your reaction to
Mm,
that?
My, I'm a big fan of I call it the authorial hand or the author's intent. It's a I like a story where you can almost picture the person who wrote the story standing over you and just like nudging a wall into place because conceptually they want you to have a good experience because um, video games are sort of the nexus of other mediums, right? Their writing, their art, their filmmaking, and all of those other mediums are about directing attention and structuring a narrative to guide the player, kind of literally drag their nose through an experience to tell an outcome. The problem with games is a lot of games they don't have that. Instead, it's like dropping a bunch of things in a sandbox and hoping that the way they happen to walk through the sandbox coagulates into a story. And that's why what a lot of games do is they cheat. They steal the through lines and narrative structures of other things. They do things like in level design, you do one way valves where you actively drop a character into a space which funnels them through a small corridor or door, and so it opens up with the exact sightline you want to tell the narrative you want. Every narrative game does this, like The Last of Us and stuff. The amount of times you coincidentally fall into a scenario that causes you to crawl through a small hole so that the camera is exactly where it needs to be to funnel the next story beat. These are like filmic tropes, right? They're stolen from framing devices because you don't have framing devices otherwise. Um, my worry with the purely systemic thing, even player driven, is players are really good at optimizing out the fun. If you allow them to create every aspect of the rules, they will make rules that are either unfun or will break the fundamental flow of the story. Some people don't mind cheats, but I think there's an underpinning most people feel, which is once you accept cheats in a game, you go, oh, cheating's fine, as in like even just games you can turn on cheats. The sort of the sacred integrity of the narrative is broken because you're like, oh, it's a toy now. It's gone from a
Right, like
story
it
to a toy.
becomes about cheating. Then.
Yes,
Yeah.
and so the short answer for me with that question is I think if you do want this, there needs to be effectively the equivalent of SQL injection parameter blocks, right? Like rather than taking inputs in, you take inputs in that almost like get filtered into did the thing the person I asked for a product, did the thing they say, is it a product, is it a definitive product with variables, is those variables things that could be created, and does it fit into the integrity of the system we have, and then only accept those outputs. And ideally, because it's yes anding anyway, you can yes and with good filters. Like you can basically you could write a JSON file with 10,000 conceivable types of products. And that sounds like you're restricting a conceptually infinite product, but you're not, because all you're doing is saying it at least has to conform to the rough specifications of the things that can be sold as commodities within reasonable sizes and can be shipped and whatever. And now you've got a safety net of all future narratives that even if they decide to build spaceships that travel, that transmit their objects, or whether they have dinosaurs that carry stuff on their backs, the fact is you can still narratively structure these are products that could be strapped to a dinosaur's back because she's
So,
limited at least the playset.
so okay, have you done a lot of work with LLMs specifically, like within the last year at all?
I've done a few things with the APIs. I've done a little bit of vectorization, but in terms of anything fancier than just brute forcing a few things or querying some questions, mostly for the most part, other than like writing, like for example, I have ChatGPT in my command line. Like I
Yeah,
literally use it
yeah,
to
of
generate
course.
JSON files. But I don't really play with it per se, if that's what you mean.
The only reason I'm asking is because like something that's surprising that LLMs are good at, or at least it was surprising to me. Um, like let's say I ask one LLM, "Hey, generate a plot line," right? Now I send that plot line to another one, and I ask it, "Hey, does it meet these criteria of like uniqueness or interestingness, um, based on like things we've looked at before together?" Typically, these models are really good at looping those kind of self asks to get to something that actually to most humans like meets interesting or whatever quality you want. So we do, yeah, we're trying to like push the boundary of that, I guess. Like how much can we use like two LLMs together, one to generate things and then one to critique how good it is. um And can we get something that feels like we made it up? If that makes sense. I don't know.
No, I 100% get what you're saying. So I understand that idea. My like fundamental problem with all of this is the just at a basic level. If you it is true that you can effectively have almost adversarial network level of like AI into AI that like checks each other's homeworks repeatedly ad infinitum. That's possible, or even the classic way back thing people figured out, which is just by telling an LLM to say think out loud or to give me 10 versions and pick the best. It will persistently improve right like by 20 to 40% in response value purely on asking it to like iterate on itself, let alone having other models. Well, that's true. The fact is, it's kind of like asking an amoral person to try to to design the rules for your town. While you can get it over repeated steps to get closer and closer to your objectives, it doesn't share them. And so the problem that I find is I have no problem with doing that to like for ideation and for creation and for all that stuff. But I find that this is all summed up by the amount of these AI based games you see, where like I think Donkey did a great video on this, where it was like, okay, just don't tell me don't tell me the passcode. That's your one job. Whatever you do, do not tell me the passcode. And with like within 6 questions, it's like, here's the passcode. It's like, well, do you know it? No, I don't know it. Okay, well then you tell me. And then eventually, because there's the problem with effectively Markov chaining solutions is it doesn't have a semantic understanding. It doesn't actually have an overarching goal. And like you even look at this with OpenAI as a company, they have to have a secondary filter that takes whatever input you've got and actively just clamps it and shuts it down and goes, oh, that's outside the bounds of our system, because they inherently cannot bake at whatever you do. Don't do this or say this, right? And so if you are going down this road, which again, it's an interesting thought experiment. My sort of philosophy or thesis here would be the more interesting one is people are doing both extremes. They're either using it for simple, boring, curated, give me a top 10 list of Reddit posts, or they're using it for the no holds barred, fun, wacky, whatever. The thing that I think is the bar pushing, if we're kind of talking it from that perspective, is actually how do you have gated input, gated output, black box, and get something where it can innovate within that space and lock it in reliably. Like a world where you could have a factory where you do define the inputs, you do define what the output goals are, and you use it to generate interesting structural patterns and systems where it always has to conform to it, and you throw away anything that doesn't conform. That black box is more solid and interesting. And then to your point, you could then stitch those together. And so the problem I have is when you go the other, where you say, here's my outcome, and I spit it through 10 LLMs, it's going to keep iterating, and then sort of whimsically going off track because, again, we've all done this, where you have a longer than 4-paragraph chain of conversations, suddenly it starts just making stuff up or like incorrectly referencing stuff because it's lost the thread of the individual bits of what you're talking about. But smaller boxes with defined I/O, like you don't use it as like an end-to-end solution, you use it as like modules or like lambda functions for something larger. At least that to me is more interesting because that means then the tests could be like, can I isolate building, like I don't build this farming system like you're describing, I build Jeff the farmer, and my goal is to build the most robust Jeff the farmer there is, and I put him in the box in the farm, and he's got a box of stuff that comes in for resources and a box of stuff that goes out, and it is his job to work the farm best. And then once I've got a formula for a good Jeff the farmer, I can spin up Daisy the farmer and do the same thing. And then the goal will be each subsequent piece is separate. But if you're trying to like stitch together effectively a UN of AI, well, that's how the UN works, right? It doesn't work particularly well in a lot of cases.
Yeah, if I can jump in here, I think I agree that the smaller AI systems working in tandem is probably like the best way to do these small black boxes to kind of facilitate pieces of gameplay rather than like generate all the gameplay itself. To jump back to your example of like an overall or of an overarching conflict or like something that's driving the player forward, the I think the piece missing from what we said about Stardew Valley is you are taking over this farm for your grandpa, but also there's this corporation in town that is like running all the small businesses out of town. It's a very like you feel that the game was designed for this this purpose of saying like big business is bad, like small town vibes are good.
100%, right? Even the Nintendo versions, it always starts with not a big bill, right? It has to start with
Right.
conflict. If it doesn't start with conflict, then why would you do anything?
So an example here of like if we are to use these smaller systems as black boxes for like I want to produce this item, and so on. I'm on this little island. I think we haven't really thought through about conflicts, but one immediate one that comes to mind that would be easy to kind of wrap around any black boxes we have is, I mean, if you think about like Hawaii or the Caymans or like all these small islands that are being oh, effectively destroyed by like tourism or like when you chop down forests, all that, like that
Yeah,
is
deforestation.
a big conflict and a big like moral uh, kind of direction that you could take the game. Like you are effectively coming to this island, and in order to run your business, you need to fish and farm and all this, which directly competes with that sort of overarching goal. Like, how do you balance? Like, we can give the player the tools to design the restaurant that they want, but if we also say, like, hey, here are the consequences for your actions, um, it,
Well, to be clear, well, I do agree. That's a good example. Like, I, I don't even mean conflict as like either broader or moral. Like as a really ridiculous example, the story could open on a cutscene of you as a kid in school, and there's another kid in the other seat, and he throws something at your head, and then you go ow and look angry, and you fast forward to you working in an office in New York City, and then you get a letter that says your uncle died or whatever, and you go back to your hometown, and that
mm-hmm,
guy owns a farm and he's doing well, and then you're inheriting a broken down farm. It's like already it's on.
right.
This kid has a farm. I'm going to beat his farm. I currently have a nothing farm. Like, so when I say conflict, it doesn't even literally have to be a concept or an issue. It literally just has to be you need to establish within the player a
Mm,
sense of, okay, we're gonna do this. It doesn't matter. It could be the
maybe
dumbest reason in the world. Just something.
maybe we should do that. It's about improving the economy of the island. Like there's a neighboring island that's your rival somehow. Like to use your idea, Jason.
Well, I think these driving factors make a lot of sense as like goalposts to hit. Like, how do you make your decisions matter both like as the character in the game, but also as the like player behind the game itself? Like, obviously, you in the game, your decisions matter by like providing stuff to the island or like improving the economy, but like your decisions also matter to you as the player if you're learning about like how to do ecosystem friendly fishing like in real life using these systems, or like what how like I'm not as much of an expert on uh, ecosystem friendly things here as I'd like, but like
Well,
how do you forage
yeah.
properly without like destroying the ecosystem? How do you go in and like take some stuff to let it continue growing instead of destroying everything? Like that's sort of stuff you can
Yeah, see,
teach the
that interests
player.
me a lot more because a good example of this is there's a fantastic book called The Goal
Hmm.
by Elijah Goldratt, and effectively it is told as a silly narrative structure, where it's a guy taking over an ailing factory,
Hmm.
and the factory is like it's basically running out of money, and they're going to shut it down. And it's told through the narrative of this guy effectively having marital issues as a result of overworking, of having the company is going crazy. He's dealing with effectively 4 or 5 different factions inside of the company, from the guys who build the sprocket things to the managerial marketing team or whatever. But the cool part of the book is the entire premise of the book is actually teaching you about the concept of throughput. Doesn't seem like it, but it's this really funny narrative where it's like he is failing or the company is failing because they completely do not understand the principal concepts of the difference between the productivity of a single unit versus the throughput of a system. And the whole thing is this like teaching concept of going, where do you put your resources, right? So that idea of teaching complex or interesting systems through gameplay is fantastic because I read that book and then I went back and played Satisfactory and I had just like a oh my god moment of like I now understand how bad at this game I was. Like fundamentally, I was misunderstanding the point. And I used to look at people who would like min max their percentages of their power of like lowering their power to 63% or something. I'm like, why are they doing that? Well, now I know exactly why they're doing it. Like it's so obvious in retrospect. So yeah, I think those kinds of things are great. You have some sort of structural system, which is basically an excuse to, again, goes back to the problem. The conflict is, I don't even know how to do this. The
Right.
solution is, how do I learn to do this? And then the way we learn this is by actively imposing problems that require you to understand the next feasible step. Like the first could be something as simple as like, I literally don't know how to like how would I even put measures in place to protect this thing? It's like, well, what measures are available? Okay, I don't even know what the conflicts are. What are the 2 or 3 things that are causing this issue in the first place? And so rather than being like a boring research thing, you can narratively structure it by like having the 12-year-old nephew who's doing a paper on it and you have to help them with his homework. It can be whatever you like structurally, as long as it comes across as some narrative reason for the player to engage with the concepts and ideas.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think having that I mean that is something that is hard to produce with LLMs, is that like consistent purpose or goal. And I think that's
And that's why I keep going say back to saying I don't think you should do that. I think what you should
yeah,
do is use it almost like the dialogue engine, right?
yeah.
Like the kinds of writers that write overarching story are often not the same ones writing dialogue because quite frankly a lot of writers suck at one or the other. And to me, I look at the LLM solution as being the flourishing, thespian who's like fills in all of the interesting narrative structure, but like the quality of the end product will be how much do you safeguard the ins and outs of the concept. And you should be building the structural like literally have a blackboard in C# which is like these are the entities, these are the types, these are the concepts, these are the narrative structures, and then let it waffle on and resolve. And then when you're done, do a sentiment analysis in the text or find the nouns of the things and then resolve it, verify it against the checklist, and then up the values appropriately. But you're keeping this like tallied score that is its memory, and more so than just feeding it back past sentences, but like actually saying there are X of these, there are Y's of these, and whatever. And I know it's not great at maths, but principally just having this sort of like more rigid structure.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think I agree with that. I think I hadn't thought through like the structure, like the purpose. I was more just working through like gameplay mechanics, but that's only like half of the game there. Um,
So I think I'm still kind of a little the other way from you guys. Like I think that the meta story, yes, this should be designed, but I think there's a way to get unique stories that are specific to whatever you're doing out of the LLMs as you play. But I'm not sure. I think it is really challenging, but I think it might be possible.
I think
Well,
one,
by
oh, go on. Sorry.
no, sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was gonna just say, I think one kind of it's almost like an audio bite. It sounds pretty cliche, but like traditionally, I've really liked the stories that were told to you as a player, like from a game. Like I um, play a lot of RPGs for the story, but I also play a lot of sandbox games like RimWorld and stuff for producing my own game. I think there's kind of two ways to embed that story in a game, and one is you tell the player a story, and the other is the player tells the story through the game. But I do think there's a very good point of like you need to give that player a reason to like produce that story. Like if I start in a game of RimWorld and I'm like, I'm just going to be a cattle rancher, like that's pretty boring. But if I start out thinking I'm going to be a cattle rancher and suddenly I'm invaded by pirates and there's like a plague, like all that's really fun. It's not really like narrative heavy, but like I am effectively telling that story and like I can tell my friends like, yeah, there was a toxic miasma cloud that fell through and mutated all my cows or whatever. um, I always
Well,
lean
yeah,
more towards those sorts of
yeah.
stories.
This is where I agree because to me, like the point of story is to bring you along on some journey. And the problem with, again, goes back to the LLM's objectives. I have no doubt you could make an LLM tell a good story, but it would be a good story in the same way you'd say, let's go on a road trip with a dog driving the car, right? It's going to, it'll happily bring you on a wacky adventure following the next shiny thing, but a good narrative isn't just a collection of fun waypoints. It is something like, if you're telling a story of a character, take even like something as Celeste, which is basically jump upwards the game, right? It's not conceptually that compelling, but the actual narrative is this really much more in-depth version of a person fighting their own self-doubt as they climb upwards, and the upwards is literally a metaphor of the physical difficulties of continuing to climb despite self-doubt. And so the physical shape of the description of the narratives in the world is part of the story. In the same way that if I was doing the dog driving a car metaphor, the the idea of me designing a road trip, I would design a road trip which would have some overarching story. Like maybe the actual road trip is people trying to get to a destination, but then hitting all of these spots that are visually impressive or fun. But then as a result, they hit traffic or miss something, and then they miss their destination, and they learn the lesson about following the shiny small things versus reaching for the end goal and failing to reach your deadline. And so an LLM will never do that. It'll structure a quote unquote good story by following good story rules, but in the microcosm. It'll make for, if you ask it to build you a fun carnival pit stop on your road trip, it'll do that. But it will never tell you a narrative structure that says, and that's why you should have continued and not gone to the carnival, because the overarching benefit of reaching your uncle's show where he was finally going to do this, that, or the like, whatever it is, like, it doesn't matter. But the point is, the structure would be that it doesn't care for the overarching story because it's not retaining that. Whether it's level design, whether it's story-driven stuff, it doesn't matter. I always vision it as a flow graph, right? It's always this thing of you draw, like, hold your finger out and draw a line, and you want a good story to have ups and downs. You want there to always be an emotional arc, and you build to stuff and you release stuff. People don't really appreciate how even level design is like this, like really fundamental things. There's a reason stairs are often associated before or after boss fights, right? Because a stair is either a climb to victory or a climb down to the depths of hell. It is a structural, physical narrative shape that builds your internal sense of how this is going to go. In the same way that narrowing corridors gives you a sense of unease, opening a space gives you a sense of wonder. And so the literal geometry decisions are part of an emotional narrative of structure. And again, an LLM is going to happily build you the thing, but it's not going to build you the thing with, oh, I'd better keep this in mind because I want them to have this emotional journey at this moment, because it doesn't have a sense of the broader story.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think I struggle to say that LLMs will never do something given like context limits increasing, and back last year when context sizes were really low, a lot of my work was in like uh, generating from a sentence into an outline into expanding each of those outlines into a chapter to try and get a lot of that like overall arc. Obviously, it wasn't super great back then. It has improved a lot, but I do think you have a lot of really good points. Of there's a lot of uh, like not surface level, like intuitive geometry and things that level designers do for invoking a specific emotion, and it's really hard for LLMs to get that sort of rhythm of like you should feel this way and then you release, and you should increase that tension and then release. Like that is probably something better left for us right now. Maybe Andrew can disagree or not, but
And I will say you're probably right. I probably shouldn't say never. I mean, I also remember the days when image generation was basically melted rainbow chihuahuas, and so the fact that we've gotten here now is still mind-boggling. So I'm willing to accept that someday it might get there, but I do think the answer is going to be a multimodal solution. It's going to be literally like we dedicate this one particular AI to spend 5 million years learning precisely how to do, Gregorian architecture and all of its themes and narratives, and then we're going to, like, you ask it a question almost like you're building your super team of individual solutions. I think that this singular Uber, chat solution is just not sustainable because, well, again, it shouldn't be failing at kindergarten maths relative to everything else, despite doing much more complex concepts.
By the way, Jason, if you have I don't know if you have any like fundamental documents or books that you really about game design or story structure or any of these things that you've been speaking about. But if you do have recommendations for those, we'd love to check them out.
Yeah.
And maybe
I'll
have an
send out a few things.
LLM semantic search them.
Yeah, I'd like to.
Honestly, I've been tempted to do that myself. I've been thinking about like, man, there's so many things I could grab and then just do a whole big like vector pull on it and then build some kind of but it's tempting.
I think I'd like to just point out that Andrew and I's background is not in game development. It's more in AI
Mhm.
and I'm from web development, and
Yeah,
so it is very, very nice to get a lot of this
super
more
nice. Really
professional
nice.
expert opinions from a better background.
Well, to be fair, I will say I'm mostly a programmer plus researcher. Like I do not really like I am literally making a VR game as a contractor for a client right now, but I would never claim expertise in that area. I'm someone very interested in the semantics of how people learn, of the specifics. Like I love game development from a like actually, you know what? Probably a better accurate statement is I'm infinitely fascinated about how my own brain works, and everything that ever affects my own brain is something I research. And unfortunately, that's
Mm.
literally every piece of sensory information that touches me. And so I end up going on these giant rabbit holes of like, why did I feel that way? Why does this game do this? Or why am I reticent to do that? Or why do I want to do that? And so it just leads you down rabbit holes. And once you do that enough times for 20 years, you start to see that actually the thematic through line of how large walls represent a sense of dread in architecture is principally the same thing as for game design, or there's why grandeur in large castles looks the same for these, that, or the other, or the classic one is windows, right? A lot of people don't think about it. High windows cast long lights, and so you end up with very oppressive feeling geometry because there's no light on you, but there's light coming from above, which you can see the concept of light, but you can't reach it, which has this sort of narrative concept of God, as in like an unreachable sense of light. And so makes you feel kind of a repressed sense of disconnection from anything above you, which is why prisons often have high stripped lights. It's to literally make you feel low energy and repressed. In contrast, low light or windows is intrigue, right? Because people don't tend to people look down with their eyes when they're walking casually, and so if you catch a small low window, almost everyone's going to go, "Ooh, what's in that?" and they're going to peek through the window, right? So if you want to invoke curiosity, you're going to put things at low obscure angles because it looks out of the way even though it's not visibly out of the way. And so like there's all of these things, and once you start looking at these stuff enough, you realize writers are doing the same thing as carpenters, as builders,
Right.
and these are all roughly the same rulebook that everyone plays from.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think Andrew and I both have really appreciated having you in the Discord. So, please feel free to participate as much as you want, and hopefully, we'll have some really interesting stuff that we can keep sharing too. But it's really great. And Andrew's from a web dev background, and me, I'm from more of I guess, hard math, mathematical background. Um,
And that I
from
will say
those
100% is my
technologies.
failing.
So,
Like I've done
Mine
web dev
too.
stuff for years, but the math stuff I am garbage. I mean 100% absolutely garbage. I did a DATS test, a different aptitude test way back when I was younger, and I think I got roughly 92 across the board, except for two things. One of them was maths and one of them was mechanical reasoning. And so like the classic multiple gears turning, which way is the end result going to go?
mm,
Both of those I was down at like 18%. So whatever that particular part of the brain is for both maths and physical reasoning, or that spatial connection, is just completely foreign to me. And I even like I've been doing games for whatever 10, 12 years, but I still have to look up basics of quaternions and vectors just like to get by. Like if I have to do anything with a grid, I have to recalculate to make sure I have all of these. It's so frustrating, but yeah, not how
so
my brain works at all.
I
Andrew and
feel
I have
that.
yeah, we've known each other forever. And when I finally learned to code, and he had been telling me he didn't like math forever, I didn't believe him. I was like, "You're lying," because I don't. Yeah, it seems like the same thing to me, but I guess it's not the same thing to everyone.
Yeah, I see it more as
No.
like storytelling through code. I'm very big on like the end product, and the math to get there is not the thing I focus on. Um, but also to jump back to level design, like
Mm.
Windows and just all these different things that I'm silent over here because I'm just reeling like, oh yeah, that's right, that's right. I am so curious now to look into like whether any of that is incorporated into like procedurally generated games like I mean, any of the popular ones, Dead Cells, Diablo, etc., that use like either these puzzle pieces of predefined spaces and fit them together, or generate the whole thing. Like I now need to go through and look at all those and see like what of those like subconscious things are incorporated and what is not, because that is definitely something that like I have a new appreciation for level designers now, being like, oh yeah, all those architecture implications and stuff that are just not even obvious, but they're in there and they make you feel a certain way without even realizing it. I feel like I've been
Yeah, there's
cheated.
so much of
It's
that.
like I've been so manipulated my whole life now, and I'm just now realizing it.
Yeah, there's so many
So,
things too that are like so subtle. Like one
hmm
of them is the fact that in almost any game which is intermittent safe zones, any of your classic like run along and go into the safe zones, you'll notice that traditionally safe zones use rounded architecture. It's like, well, that's silly. It's like a small thing, but you're often sitting in a literal half circle because corners or spiky edges are like psychologically sharp or pointy, or like they represent a change of an angle. There's something psychologically sharp about that. But rounded
hmm
corners is, so you'll notice in real architecture, people will build places for children in those in rounded shapes for that exact reason. It's much more psychologically comfortable.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I assume you've seen this, but this is
Mm.
the effect they gave
Yeah,
research
Kiki.
people
Yeah, I remember
these
that one. Yeah.
two subjects and said which one is Kiki, which one is Boba. Overwhelmingly, the sharp one is Kiki, the soft one is Boba. Uh, it's just the way our brains work, I guess. Just those rounded shapes, spiky shapes. It's just feels.
Then there's the entire. Have you heard of Gestalt theory?
Oh yeah.
That's the shape relations, right? So it's this is other stuff that we sort of take into account of how do we imply connection and relation between different shapes and elements. And again, there's often very little there that's tangible, but it's more like, oh, that's a village, or this is a certain small town or area, and it's often just geometrically down to where does the it's the classic, like you see a shape that's actually uh, it's the invisible space between two other shapes. It's you're conceptualizing the difference that's not really there, but it's more
Mm-hmm.
prominent than the real things that are there because you have a certain shape relation understanding.
I see. Yeah,
Yeah, there you go.
I have
Exactly. That's
seen
right.
this. Yeah, yeah. There's just so much like
Mm.
at every level, like you can get as detailed down, drill down, and it's just subconscious stuff all the way down. Like I am also very, very interested in like all how our brain reacts to things, why our brain reacts to things. Um, Not enough time in the day to learn it all, really.
True, yeah. Well, that's why I literally watch content at 3.5x speed. It freaks people out, but it's one of those things where over time you just get used to it. I will say though, from a like games that are procedural that use this stuff or that how they could use it, um, a really good example of this, which is sort of like almost accidental out of this.
hmm
I'm sure you're familiar with wave function collapse, are you?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so principally, if you think about it, that's what that is, right? It's not as tangibly encoded, but whether you're talking about L theory or wave function collapse, any of these like procedural stepped systems, they're rule engines, and the thing about those is they often Townscaper is a great example where it's not just like, isn't it fun if I put two blocks together, it turns into a third block. It is saying if I put these together, then maybe this should be a small village, or maybe this should represent this won't structurally fit, and so I have to put this in place to make the structure more sound. So if I was
hmm
hypothetically going to build something that had that concept, I would very much be leaning into probably some kind of wave function collapse, because it is effectively by saying this thing next to this thing results in this thing. It is a perfect candidate for building like make me a spooky area. And it's like, cool, well, then I will put things together that lead to narrow corridors into long staircases, because that is conceptually spooky, right?
Right,
Is these
right.
kinds of things would naturally come about.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. I have been so excited to use wave function collapse in something since learning about it, but I haven't built anything using it yet. But I think incorporating a lot of that, like,
Oh, so sorry. So wave function collapse is this is a term for what this game does. right? You showed me
Yes,
this, right?
it's the
Andrew?
tech of how it works. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay, okay.
It
Well, wave
basically.
function collapse means something different to me.
So yeah, that people often talk about it isn't it isn't that's the quantum physics proportion.
Right,
It's
right.
basically the reason they call it this is
I
because
follow so much better. I follow the conversation so much better now. I was like,
the reason they call it this is because you're kind of seeing here. It's effectively that you're building this concept of possibility spaces that are like
right.
this could be any one of these 10, and because above it is because below it is grass, therefore above it must be plants. You are
Right.
collapsing the possible function. So they're using the nomenclature of that like quantum collapse, but
No,
yeah,
it
obviously
makes
it's
sense.
not
It makes
really the
sense.
same thing.
Right? Because it's like, oh, when I place this new block, it could be any number
Exactly.
of,
Yeah.
maybe even like theoretically infinite different possibilities,
Mhm.
but the surrounding area collapses it to this. Like when
Yeah.
I did it
Exactly.
this
Yeah.
one, and if I did it 10 times, it might not always collapse to the same thing.
And so I guess to kind of circle into how we we're saying that like if there are known quantity rules for like how do you build a space that's supposed to represent a hospital,
Yeah.
well, a lot of people don't think about it. Like people think about it in terms of okay, yeah, there's rooms with chairs, but what they don't think about it is well, actually, based on square footage and the fact that people will have low mobility in lots of spaces, you have to have X number of bathrooms within regions of beds, right? You cannot have things of that particular length and whatever. And so there's a lot of this architectural stuff that you could bake into a system like this that
Yeah.
makes more quote unquote readable hospitals, even if
Man, and
people don't understand why.
I really like the idea of finding information like that and then letting your LLM that you're using for procedural generation search it and read it and
Mm.
apply what's in it. It's very interesting.
Yeah, I think my main problem with wave function collapse is I think like similar to kind of your concerns with LLMs before is it's difficult to because it's filling in each space based on its immediate neighbors. It's difficult to have that cohesive
Mm.
like guarantee this hospital has more rooms than bathrooms. Like it could potentially just generate a bunch of bathrooms or like a bunch of things that don't necessarily read as the space you're trying to build. It is
Mm.
valid, but it's not designed.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's why for level design traditionally it's very different. Like if you're
Mm.
there's maze algorithms which do different stuff, and then there's like I'd say 10 prominent ones, and they range from building rooms with set numbers of entrances and exits, and then you stitch them together based on those, to more interesting ones where you first place down the large needed buildings, and so you'd say must have X number of rooms that facilitate hospitalness, X that facilitate admin, and then X that are whatever utility rooms, and then you would have it procedurally place those within the appropriate rule set bindings around them. And then because what wave function collapse excels at is specifically like extending like a texture that you want to extend infinitely, that's kind of what it's best at. You could then take your new map that's got all of the locked in requirements set and then just build the corridors effectively or build any of the stitching material. So yeah, usually you wouldn't if that was your goal, you wouldn't like run it raw through this.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, for example, I just grabbed one of the maps generated here, but if this were meant to be a hospital and these were like hospital rooms and bathrooms and stuff, if your goal were to have like 10 hospital rooms for whatever reason in your game, you would place those first and then generate the rest of the map around it.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
There's
because
another
each
there's
time
another
you
concept
place
called
it,
L
it
systems for
makes sense.
building like fractured trees. That I don't know if you've heard that term.
I
L
haven't
system.
seen that.
It's kind of more of a principle thing. You've probably seen that sort of procedural tree build up. Um, this is a similar kind of thing, but this is a lot more yes and. What's really cool, it's really simple conceptually. It's literally you just have a character represent each thing. Like if you had the letter L represents a left node, M represents another node, and then you build a sentence, and then you run the sentence through the processor, and then the output sentence you run that through the processor, and if it likes something, it'll attach a B to an AB, and you get an ABB, and then you kind of run that through, and then ABB resolves to something else, and so in this way,
Interesting.
that's another way to do it, where you can have this sort of like my room doesn't have a bathroom, but it needs one. Okay, it has a bathroom, but it now needs to have within the bathroom X number of distance range, and you could keep stitching it through, and so you get a procedural generation, but it's continually regurgitating the same rules, and that would allow you to like keep building onto the conception of the last one. I wouldn't know how you'd approach this to build something like we're describing, like a hospital, but I can see how the principles of this could certainly appeal in terms of like a recursive sort of like run through the rules to keep expanding, but yet validating the same rule set.
Yeah, it's kind of like a grammar, and I can see some things like if you have B as a boss room, like maybe you want to expand that out into always having a save point beforehand, or like always having a treasure room afterwards. Like I can kind of see that
Mm.
resolving into kind of these mini sequences you want. Um, but obviously, there's a lot more to be done here. I hadn't seen this before. I'm looking at it. Yeah, this is really cool. I will bookmark this to look through
It's
more.
most commonly known for building fractals, really, but it's like it obviously you can build other stuff with it, but
Hmm.
it's particularly fun to play with.
Gotcha. Huh.
It's also way more accessible than going the wave function collapse, because for wave function collapse you have to build all of the rules and stuff. For this, like, it's actually more exploratory. It's kind of got more of that LLM vibe, because you only build small rules, and then the fact of the compounding rules can actually like influence itself, where you don't realize it's not just adding new things, it'll actually modify the old stuff based on the new positions of the stuff associated to it, and you get sort of much more interesting built up shapes.
Interesting. Huh. Yeah. No, this. Probably want to build something with this too.
This is so exciting. I love that we get to work on this. It's so much fun. Like,
It really is.
I hope that we can put out a really great game from what we learned from all this.
I will say I kind of missed at the very start, like the actual core game stuff. So just broadly, are we talking? Is it like top-down click style farming game, or what's the actual like playing experience?
Yeah. We're still kind of figuring out some of that, but in general, like top-down, control a character, maybe just keyboard only. Kind of Stardew Valley-esque, but instead of just working on the farm and like selling stuff to town, you're instead producing those items to run a restaurant. So if you kind of need to manage that inventory, and like the cool aspect, the demo aspect is being able to decide what you want to sell in your restaurant and then having it produce those items around town or within these systems that we've defined.
Mm.
Um,
Mm. Hey, Andrew,
Uh,
I'm gonna jump in real quick because I think also, Jason, you may be asking a little bit, like, not just about this particular game that we're talking about, but maybe like our overall trajectory, like what we're trying to do. Are you asking a
yeah,
little
yeah,
bit
no,
about
I do,
that?
because I've seen, for example, the other couple of games on the different streams, but yeah, so yeah, more holistically, you're right. It's kind of vaguely like I know what I want from the games industry and vaguely what I lean towards, and I get a sense that you guys enjoy this aspect and want to push the technology concepts further. So yeah, just more broadly, like what does success look like for you?
Yeah,
right.
yeah. So currently we're focused on like each game and each demo that we build, we want to build additional libraries that are used for either generative aspects or including LLMs in the game mechanics, like Andrew did with You Are Not Alice, and we did with Smack to the Future before that. And our goal in the medium term is to put them together into a strategy game, like a large strategy game. That's what we would like to build.
Ah,
Um,
okay, okay,
and then
and
on the
no, sorry, no, no,
sorry.
no,
So
no, no,
then
sorry, okay.
on more of like the 3 to 5 year horizon, if we can make a successful strategy game and essentially build both software libraries and also organizational knowledge about how to build good games around the LLM libraries that we built, our long-term goal would be to build an MMO using them. But that's more of like, a 3 to 5 year type thing where we would start working on
Mm.
that. So first we're starting at the ground level, like building libraries that just include an LLM that makes a decision in the game. That was Smack to the Future. And then let's include LLMs that you talk to as the main mechanic. That was You're Not Alice. And now we're pushing it a little further of like, okay, can we have a coherent meta story, but inside of it, LLMs are generating a lot of the events that emerge or like things that the player is
Okay.
doing. Yeah, so I don't know if that story makes sense to you, but Andrew, would you say I kind of captured the direction there?
Yeah, I think so. I think one other example is probably this paper that we've shown everyone of, I don't know if you've seen where they simulated basically a town of people. And they,
Yes. Yeah.
yeah, it was a popular paper. We kind of saw like, oh yeah, one character, they let drop that they have a birthday coming up, so somebody
And then they
else.
organically built one. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so our whole like what drove us from the beginning is something like that, where you have these AI agents in a game kind of um, performing their own game in a sense, like they are acting on their own, and you in a strategy game are you need to identify like what they're trying to do, what they want, and like obviously there's a lot of different power dynamics you can do in this sort of situation. Like either you're in charge of them all or you're like on the same power level as them, you're somebody else in town, like planning a
Well,
rival
I
birthday
grew up
party.
playing Black and White Lionhead Studios, so I can totally see that world of.
Gotcha.
Although, if it was me as a like a whimsical, if I was a game designer trying to use these mechanics, I
Hmm.
would go the other way for fun, which would be I would actively have myself as a trying to undercut a company. It's like I'm someone in the company who's like has no power, but
Hmm.
I cannot like have overarching goals. But what I can do is I can cause interpersonal issues by spreading rumors between members and
Yeah,
try to get the team to fall apart and fail the project they're building. Because that goes back to the conflict thing where I'm introducing the conflict, and my conflict is I hate this company because they're doing something bad to my town, and I have this like moral value where I can mess with all of these people in a way that's compelling, but also the system is designed to like ignore me, and so trying to worm my way in, now you're positively motivating hacking the kind of concept of a LLM and how it works.
Exactly. Yeah,
mm-hmm.
I think when I get back to like You Were Not Alice and work more on like the overall narrative structure, that's kind of the direction I wanted to go. Is like you may be a hacker, like a bad on the surface, coming in and disrupting this, but the kind of overarching plot that I was expecting to play with is like, oh, you're finding out that this company is actually a really bad company, so you have this opportunity. Like you don't really have a lot of power, like being one of these employees or like pretending to be one of these employees, but you do have the power to kind of disrupt some of the stuff within the company. Um,
Well, so this like I don't have to derail you too much more from this, but this interests me. This is where stuff starts to interest me. It's like so the again going back to the problem I have with the concept of the LLM like as a decision maker.
mhm,
I don't like the capricious god aspect, right? Like it's like it just has too much of a it plays by its own rules and whims. It's very hard to kind of engage with. But one thing it does excel at that I use a lot is the narrative stuff. Like we talked about how it's good at dialogue, it's good at conversation, it's good at filling in those different parts.
mhm,
And so to my point earlier about having an overarching structure that retains kind of a solidity to it, for example, how I would approach this the way you're doing it is, do you know Ink and Inkle?
Ink and Inkle? I do not.
Yeah, Ink is a language, and Inkle is the yeah. I always get the order wrong. It's a narrative scripting language, and it's actually really simple. It
Mhm,
literally uses spaces and asterisks to like represent decisions and branching strategies, and so you can describe an entire like RTS game level of dialogue. And what's really cool is you can embed hashtags and various different things that you then this literally you take this file,
mhm,
it has Unity integration automatically, turns into a JSON file, builds an in-memory model, and then you literally say play, and you play it like a story, and it writes the line of dialogue with all the metadata you've attributed to it, which is how people like hook up images and icons. And then you can give it the list of available options. So those options can branch and have tree structures, and this whole concept of knots and branches and nested branches. And you can structure an entire game's worth of narrative in this very textural, easy to use thing. And it's really cool because you can have sort of you can run it like you can here. It has a separate runner. So you can write your game, test the narrative, and have no connections to the game, and then just drop it in and run it. I say all of this to say my approach to the way you're doing stuff is rather than having an endless, like, just type anything in, which has that sort of whimsical, vague, how are the player going to engage, it is much more compelling to me, and goes back to like what I don't see people doing, is rather than having this runtime connect to the LLM, give me the possible solutions to whatever the person said, which leads to that sort of one, delays, which is less compelling for games, and then two, more vagueness. Having the questionnaire up front of like, what do you want to make? Who are you? Tell me your story to start the thing. And then I would literally just run the like, you and I, Mr. LLM, are going to have an entire conversation. And I'm going to ask you in this conversation, what 4 questions could I ask you? Give me one that's like an angry, or one that's continues positively, one that continues negatively, one that's whatever. And then you effectively have it build you your RTS narrative tree. And if you could even teach it possibly to have the structure thing correctly, that would be great. And then you would end up having a game which has literally all of the elements they described, runs in real time, gives you dialogue RTS choices, which are actually compelling and matches vaguely what they're saying based on the characterization of the characters you've defined in your story, but isn't endlessly open-ended and is within the parameters of your structure. And you could pepper in the tags of the various different elements of value you would need to feed into other LLM stuff to then factorize and build up your different stuff. And in the player's experience, they're playing a literal written narrative with actual RTS choices, but the outcomes are all driven from their choices, because that to me is like that perfect melding of like both worlds, where you're not leaving it open-ended and you're still getting that narrative structure, because you could literally enforce it in the literal narrative the story's writing.
It's really interesting. We actually talked about, with this game we were brainstorming for on stream here, having it open with you showing up on the island and you go talk to like the Chamber of Commerce or something and say like, okay, I would like to run a hot dog stand, and answer some other questions for them.
Yeah.
And this is what generates a lot of the, like, you know, the different types of harvesting or resource collecting that you might be doing, and different progression. Like, we were even thinking, okay, we could maybe generate a skill progression. So you start out at level 1 cooking, and for the hot dog stand, you might have the ability to make a plain all beef hot dog there. And level 100 might be, okay, you can make a Chicago dog. Yeah. And this is like something that we can produce for you there. So I think, yeah, it is really interesting, because you want a progression, you want an interesting story, but also the other thing you can do is give the other characters in the story a memory of their own that they can search through. And that is what creates a lot of the interesting behavior in that paper that we linked to. So
Plus, like, again, I cannot stress enough from like a narrative storytelling perspective, it's amazing how little you need to really build a narrative. Have you played the game Firewatch?
Is that the firefighter game?
Yeah, the firefighter sort of walking around dialogue one.
I did not. Uh,
So the game gets a lot of praise and it's well designed, it's blah blah blah, it has a lot of interesting stuff. But that's not really the interesting part to me. The interesting part is one of the most incidental parts of the whole game. So it literally opens with that sort of ink style dialogue. It tells you a story of you're this guy and you're like you work at this company and you meet this girl on a night out. How do you approach? And it just asks you like, do you approach with a cocky one-liner, or do you fumble your way into conversation? And they're all really like surface level, very binary, not particularly interesting. But there's a couple of small things which are just fun anecdotes. Like, you go to an adoption center to pick up a dog. Do you pick up the German Shepherd or do you pick up the Poodle? And if you pick up the German Shepherd, do you call him Savage or do you call him Cuddles or whatever? It's like really basic-y stuff. And then there's like another bit later where it's like you have this private joke with your girlfriend where it's like, draw me like one of your French girls, the classic bit. And then do you ask her to draw you like a badass, or do you ask her to draw you like, a wilting flower or something? And so all of this doesn't do much except there's a single photo in your firehouse of the thing she drew for you. You're either your character like looking buff and badass, or your character sort of in a fainted violet kind of vibe. And then the dog thing I think has one other little like one liner somewhere later. But what's really powerful about that is one, it locks your presence into the world. But there's probably a bigger one, and it's kind of it's a really like sets the tone for the whole story. Is your girlfriend at the start of the story effectively gets mental illness? I think it's dementia, and you're effectively given a choice about whether it haggers you and you start to feel exhausted by it, or whether you hold firm. And then how do you deal with that? Do you stay with her and feel resentment for it, or do you leave and go to the bar and ignore and whatever? And then the story plays out exactly the same. It's still a character who's got demons, who had issues and needed to step away from the world, and it's whatever. And it's not super relevant to the overarching part of the main story, but it will inform every decision the player makes, because they've built up a mental narrative of who they are, and whether they're a piece of shit who left someone behind that they kind of felt they should have stayed with, or whether they feel like they tried their best and they need a break, and that this is their justification in the universe, or whatever narrative they build up for themselves. And so it's not even just the pragmatic of like data detection stuff. It can fundamentally alter whether or not your character, the player, is going to be more willing to choose these kinds of decisions. The more psychological aspect of this, which fascinates me endlessly, is there was a study done on, I wish I could remember the exact details, but basically they had a room full of people and they showed them a collision between two cars. And then they quizzed each group, they split the people into groups and asked them afterwards, and just by the tone of the question, they said, how fast was car A going when it hit car B? Then the other group, they asked, how fast was car A going when it tapped car B? And the third group, how fast was car A going when it smashed into car B? And obviously, as you can imagine, right, there was a good like 5 to 8% difference in both scales, exclusively down to the leading question. And so tonally, your game can set a precedent for the kind of experience you want someone to have just by a little bit of narrative leading. And like you can imagine how powerful. That's why to me, again, we go back to the LLM thing. LLMs are an open sandbox where it's like type in your dream. And it's like, I don't need to do that. I think that's too open ended, because you get that analysis paralysis thing. I think what you need to do is grab enough information to seed a compelling story, and then feed it back to them in ways they didn't even realize, because there's subtext in how people write things. If you can catch the subtext of the sentences, you can make a compelling story that appeals to them without actually having to ever ask them for the specific details. And that to me is where you're going to get that oh wow moment, where people are like, oh, this feels like me, and I never actually told it these details.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think with our first game, uh, our brawler game, we had in the conversation we had three different generated responses they could choose from, and also the ability to um, write their own. And I'm thinking now that the generated responses we probably could have written ourselves in order to, or like generated ourselves ahead of time in order to kind of coerce these specific narratives that they could go down. Um, but I also do very much like the ability for them to write their own response, because I think what we saw before we had the ability for them to write their own response, there was no. It all just felt like a traditional game, which is great. Like you can make a great game that way. What we're trying to do is kind of push the boundaries of what is possible with that AI. But what we saw from that demo specifically was that the people that wrote their own responses was like 3 or 4 times higher when they were also given those pre-generated responses to like choose from, because it gave them, I assume because it gave them like examples of tone of what they could write instead of having that like
Actually,
blank
so
page.
it's actually a little bit more complicated than that, which is kind of fascinating. So the psychology behind that decision, a good example of this is there was two studies in the book. What was it called? Rational, improbably rational, I think, or rationally improbable. I can't remember the exact book name. But two things that stood out to me there that was particularly fascinating is one of them. They said there was a company that was trying to sell bread makers, Bread makers was a brand new product on the market. There wasn't really a lot of uptick for it, and so people were looking at it going, "Why would I buy a bread maker? Like literally, what need do I have as a human being to buy a bread maker?"
Mm-hmm.
And they just couldn't sell it. And so what they did is they had a product that was reasonably priced and decent size and good value and whatever. So how did they sell this bread maker? Well, they made a second bread maker that was more expensive and worse.
Yeah.
Because if you put a larger, worse product on the shelf, people are going, well, I'm like half on the fence whether I even want a bread maker, but if I was going to get a bread maker, I would clearly get the cheaper, better one.
Right,
And
right.
so you've given them an anchor point, so you're setting a tone. A much more interesting version of this was the holiday one. Like there was another study where they said, okay, do you want to go to Greece with the free breakfast, go to Turkey with the free breakfast, or do you want to go to Japan? These are your three holiday choices. And without realizing it, a lot of people write off Japan immediately because it feels harder to compare. Because
Mm-hmm.
there's no act, it's all like what? How do you measure the quality of this holiday when you know no details about it all? But if I tell you two of them have a breakfast and one of them doesn't, you're like, well, at least I know they have a breakfast. And so therefore, the measurement marker for me is I can get rid of the one that doesn't conform to the other narrative thing. So it's more so than just having choices. It's that the act of having choices, one, gives you an anchor point to start from, but second thing, I think it's called comparison bias, is that people favor scenarios where things can be slightly different than others. Every time you give someone a choice, do you want this or this that's red, versus do you want this or like what's better, Apple or television? It's like I don't. How do I even make my brain process that question?
But you can
Versus
choose
what's better,
apple
Apple
or
or orange, right?
orange. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's so much easier because you've got a framing direct. So having those things, and that's why a lot of those narrative choices, even it's boringly uh, binary of good or bad. Good or bad is a very clear. Oh well, I literally want to play it this way or this way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we can get into the whole like narrative structure stuff of why that's a bad general question, but at least it explains why it's easier. Like it's at least conceptually, it's so much more relaxing to be given that question.
Yeah, I think there's I mean, a lot of the responses generated were bad, and so it makes it really easy to be like, oh, well, these are the bad options. I can write a better one. It's kind of that worst bread maker. Um, but a lot of them were interesting and like they had interesting tones, which I think also um, you probably want to write those ahead of time so you can control those tones. But they did set like uh, I think Josh was in the stream earlier, but somebody was talking to. I don't know if you played this game, but basically, it's a brawler. At the end, you have the police show up, and you have to convince them you're innocent. Um, so,
I think you brought it up on stream, right? You actually showed the.
oh yeah, I probably
Yeah.
did. But some people had super crazy stories, and they loved it. And what was happening was the suggested responses were just as crazy, and so it like kind of compounded and people went crazier and crazier with their own responses. But a lot of times they would say like, "Hey, I'm actually like a fish," which is silly, but the generated responses would bring them back to like real responses of talking to a police.
Mm.
So it was kind of nice to have that sort of like railroading. We didn't necessarily like intend for that to happen, and sometimes it had the opposite effect of like you say you're a fish, and then the suggested responses have you double down of like, oh, you're a minnow, like I'm gonna eat you because I'm a fish, which is not the greatest, but people. I think it was kind of the cool aspect was the what we learned from that is like you can generate responses all you want, but in the end, if they don't take into account something that the player did or like intended to do, they just feel like pre-generated responses. Like there's no difference between generating a
Mm.
bunch of responses ahead of time. Um, like if
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I guess the problem with that, and my again, just purely my opinion here,
Mhm.
that there's a concept in MMOs, well, not just MMOs, but basically a lot of games that have player-owned land, that they usually call it the staircase problem,
Mhm.
which is if you've got so in a lot of MMOs that have kind of player-owned shops, whenever there's a player-owned shop section, you're going to find a nearly perfect grid of placed square shop locations because players are not good. designing things because they're not designers. Or the other example is literally if you have any game where you can build geometry, you're only going to get two things. You're going to get staircases to the sky and giant penises.
Yep.
Littered across your horizon will be those two things.
Mhm.
And you can allow that, and that's like it's not a. There's an argument to be made, but my thesis to this whole discussion, the kind of the point, the reason I'm leaning more in the guardrails, is not so much that I don't think it can be fun and creative, but I think that at the end of the day, the one thing holds true above all else, which is a player of your game that is not trained in storytelling won't write a good story. A player of your game that's not trained in level design won't write a good level. And a player of your game that and to go back to the optimizing fun, it's the same thing. If they're not just going to optimize out the fun, they're going to actively make themselves have an unfun experience most of the time. Now, they might have a fun time by like what you described. Like I've talked to ChatGPT and had a scenario where I had a penguin who was a terrorist who was taking over a bank, and then we gave them a pill to turn to zombies, and then one of them turned to be a pacifist, and then we had to talk him down, and then like it's crazy and it's fun.
Right.
What you've got now is a toy, not a game, right? And that's my worry is if your vague thesis argument here is to elevate the form of games using AI, my argument would be games haven't even caught up to bucks in narrative quality, and the idea of trying to surpass the structure of a narrative is nearly impossible. But what you can do is you can actually use AI to leverage the missing narrative portions from games via books. Because LLMs have eaten all of the best books in the world, rather than trying to elevate to one step further to player driven content and all the other stuff, it's a much easier, much more achievable, and much more boxable and quite frankly, possibly sellable goal to say, can we leverage all aspects of this to generate stuff that feels like you hired a good writer? And that leads to better games outright. And it doesn't have to be just blanket static stuff. Like you said, you can still pepper it with ideas and principles and ideas of your game. You can get tone. You can even like literally have a story that halfway through the story stops, reevaluates the state of a person's farm, and rewrites the story to add a conflict where, based on the size they're at this point in the game, rewrite the entire thing to know whether or not they're going to be attacked by a mega corporation or whether X, Y, or Z is going to happen. So I'm all for using it for compounding the effects of good narrative storytelling, but as soon as you start allowing players to go, but no, it's a sentient bottle of water, it's like, well, cool. Like as soon as you give that option, I don't think it's just doing a disservice to their own experience. I think it's doing a disservice to the product offering you're giving, because you're basically saying if one avenue of this is infinite messing around, then it can always be devolved to that, and therefore it's very hard for people to like. You'll never have as strong of an emotional journey. They might enjoy it, but if there's any point there's a viability, like even a 1% chance it turns into a wacky story, they end up with a wacky story. But if that's not an option, you have a potential to tell a compelling narrative where, to your point earlier, they can go to their friend and say, I played this game and I turned out to be a assassin farmer who was protecting sentient turkeys, whatever, but I didn't write that. That happened out of the sheer course of actions of the story, which was presented to me. And it feels organic to my choices. So I think again, it can even go wacky, just as soon as you give player choice, they are going to write something that is quite frankly mostly stupid, unless you have a good writer on hand. And again, most players are not going to be good writers. That's kind of broadly my opinion anyway.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think as a writer and a uh, game developer, it is easy for me to be like, oh, I'll make a system where I can make my own levels and make my own everything because I know like what is good and what is not. But I think, yeah, you're right. The average person is just like, I don't know what I'm supposed to say here, or I don't know what would be fun here. It's you, thinking about a different audience is, I think, the sweet spot to hit is probably somewhere in the middle where you're using these AIs as smaller systems that augment the rest of the game and provide this sort of organic flow versus asking the player like, all right, what do you want to do next? Where do you want to go? Who do you want to
Mm-hmm.
meet? I think if you use them more as like you tell the LLM, this is what the player has done so far. What should happen to them next. What choices should they have? What two choices should they choose between? I think that's a really good start. I think obviously there's a lot more work to be done in like making sure those choices are good choices and telling the story you want to tell and like railroading them in the correct way. But yeah, that's obviously like if you show up on this island and the very first thing is like, okay, you're starting a restaurant. What's the first thing you want to add to your menu? There's a good chance they're just going to type penis. And like, what are you going to do there? So yeah, I think these sort of like I think Andrew and I are both on the same page of like we want it to be really, really open ended and very sandboxy and like we want the game to respond to the player. But I think there is a lot of uh, good in making sure the player is good faith playing the game. Um, I think there's
Well,
a. Oh, go on.
I think it's even. I was gonna say, I think it's even more than that. Like, for example, like I look at open world games, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you follow the trajectory of the Assassin's Creed upwards, you end up with this thing of like that was a marvel at first. The world felt very real. I could walk around, and even just the little hand gestures where the character would say "excuse me" as they walked by. That was so powerful when I first played that as a kid. Um, and then once you start to formulaically build that into, there's always a tower that you climb up. There's always a some
Right.
scan of the area. There's always these different hotspots, and that everything's roughly the same. You start to hit this sort of like structural disappointment of like, oh, okay, it is systems because of course I can start to see the boundaries of doing that. And so for me, it's not even just that people will quote unquote possibly ruin it through messing. I think the problem with a play space that is designed around that procedurality is I truly believe AI driven games will be the next open world games. I think within the next 4 years, we're going to see at least three big budget games where there will be some, even if it's something as simple as a shop NPC who will be
Mm-hmm.
spitting out dialogue bits, or probably smarter companies will start with barks. They will just generate like 500 different, I got him, that's my sword, or whatever. There's tons and tons of it because that's such a lightweight and like low risk version of it. But I think more and more it'll happen until you end up getting games that glom into the same space in that like just like there's 500 Minecraft clones and it's like what is differentiating these? Well, there's nothing to it. They're literally the same game bar art or whatever. The problem with LLMs is they all quote unquote speak with the same voice. Now, yes, you can theme it and ask it to act like a different person, but there's always this butlery-esque desire to positively support you kind of underbaked into how it structurally communicates with you, and there's a roboticism to it unless you actively like weed it out, and that's very hard to do. um at least when you're like when it's engaging with you as a person, if you're talking to it, it's again it's literally trying to be helpful to respond to you. But to kind of go back to like counter my own point there, I do think not just using it for like decision making for writing the story, I think it really excels at role playing a character. I
Hmm.
think something that I probably my favorite moment of ever using ChatGPT was very early on. It was well, I'll say early on, it was like 3 or something. Um, I was getting really fed up with this sort of anemic robot friend, and I was just like, this is so boring to me. This is so clinical and disinteresting, and like I want this to be fun. I want to actively enjoy having a conversation with this thing. And so
Mm-hmm.
I tried so many different variants of trying to get it to be fun to talk to, and with all the guardrails, it just kept doing the "I am a robot who
Yeah.
can't give those." Like it's so exhausting. And I eventually found something that worked for me, which was there was they classically called it the character prompt, right? Like act like character X from series Y and only respond as them and do not change. It still fails a lot. It still does, like, especially if you ask it to do stuff out of character. But my favorite moment of ever using this stuff is I asked it to act like a character from a show, and I may have mentioned before, but the show was Warehouse 13, and I picked
Yes.
that because because there was the girl hacker character in that who I was like, okay, who would be a good, like, if you were like sitting in an office with a bunch of people and you wanted to like turn over your shoulder and say, hey, I have a programming question for you, and you wanted someone who would be helpful but also be a bit snarky but has your sense of humor but is like going to throw some memes in but be reasonable. It's like that to me is like the epitome of that character in a way where I don't have to write an essay to describe them. um And so I went with that character. And then I was like, cool, set the parameters. Now let's just treat it like a standard model. And I was like, okay, let's pretend it's like Google or whatever. I'll ask it a question. And I was like, how big is Mount Everest? And the first response I got back was, I don't know, man, but it's probably bigger than both of us put together. And I was like, thank you. This is exactly what I wanted. And then I ended up just like, having a bunch of conversations and asking about programming stuff. And I'm like, oh, I'm thinking about using JSON for this. So, I guess you can. That's one way to do it. If you're feeling spicy, it's like, this is
Right.
such, and I keep going through it. And then it was getting these kind of, at one stage, I remember it devolving into, I said I wanted to try something, and it said to me, "That's a bold move, Cotton." And I'm like, "That is exactly what I would have said to somebody as like a stupid joke to respond." And then I was like, "How far can I push this?" And I asked it about Doctor Who, and I said, "Okay, what's your favorite Doctor?" And it's like, "Oh, you're gonna hate me for this." I'm like, "What do you mean?" He said, "I like Peter Capaldi." I'm like, "How the hell can you say he's the best Doctor?" He said, "Okay, look, listen," and it ended up having this genuine debate, and I was like caught off guard, and I caught myself and went, this is where the most danger comes from this stuff, because the the fact is I have like massive cross disciplinary interests, right? Like clearly I like a lot of random crap. And the
Mhm.
likelihood of talking to somebody who has similar interests is one, rare. Two, finding people who can teach you something new about them is rare. And then three, finding people you engage with socially or have good humor or whatever. And so it clicked for me that it's like the compelling part of this isn't just that it's like can sound funny or natural or human. It's that it can be specifically tailored to be someone that quote unquote gets me with my humor and my style of whatever, but also can engage. Like if I say, "Hey, I'm currently studying ancient Byzantine architecture," it's like, "Cool, I love that." It's like, "Do you?"
Right. Let
Because
me tell you
literally,
about that.
I am never going to find another person who can simultaneously engage with me on whatever random ass hobby I picked up this week, but also throw in the kinds of jokes about giraffes that were in the middle of the conversation we're having or something. And
Right.
so that to me, I think, is like, again, we're going back to what is the point of this whole rant, is to say we're talking about elevating games using AI. And to me, this little conversation I had while like asking a programming question was the most gamified, fun moment I've had in game or like in the thing in a long time. I was like, can't that be enough? That's already revolutionary. If you give me a game where people make jokes about the classic fetch quest or having to do a follower, and like the common complaint being this NPC has a walk speed that's like just annoying enough that's constantly a pain in my ass, it's like, well, the other one is I hate these characters. They're cardboard cutouts. They're boring. They're lifeless. I don't care. And it's like, well, how do we make characters you care about? Well, you can hire a writing team and write a really complex narrative and go the Baldur's Gate route, or you can do a small questionnaire and say, what era did you grow up in? What's your favorite comics and cartoons? And go, bam, you've now got someone who's got all of the same, grew up in the same area you did, has the same interests and hobbies, and has a witty dialogue with you. And you can take that, and this goes back to like my thing, is you could have a natural language conversation. That's one thing, but I think it's much more compelling. And there's a whole other argument I could go on with narrative flow and unveiling structure through VR stuff, which is a real fun topic I've ranted on in the past. But imagine this, right? With everything I've painted as a picture, imagine you do the questionnaire thing and you play a game and you can't type in responses.
Mhm.
Maybe literally there's a narrative reason why your character has just like been in an accident and has a bloody thing on their mouth they can't talk, or so their jaw's broken or something. And then you go through the story and you and this NPC character have arranged some like series of hand signals to communicate, or some like pilot cards, and that the running joke is that they're written specifically to sort of get what you're saying but make fun of you for it and like pretend to misunderstand you. And so you can build up this banter and dialogue with this character where you go on a compelling adventure with them. But then at the pinnacle of the story, as all of this stuff's going on, that you break the limitation. You remove that thing and you're like, oh, you got your cast off. You can now talk to this person that you're already engaged with before the first line of you typing dialogue. And what you've done is you've bypassed that incentive for someone to say just penis outright, because they now actually engage with the character before you give them the chance to start typing. And they're going to want to retain this fantasy story that they've built up. So again, I'm not saying that you can't have player decision making, but there's a lot of leading the dog you can do with this, which leads to them not ruining it for themselves.
Yeah, I think that's a very good example of like getting them invested before they can ruin things. uh, yeah, very good progression. I mean, it kind of solves the like blank page problem. Like the very first thing they're supposed to say, like you want to give them some very simple, do you say this or this? You don't want them to say like, okay, what do you say to this person you've just met? Uh, and I think that's a really cool idea of being able to like have that running joke and banter too. So all around that's a great example. I don't know if you just came up with that on the spot, but
Pretty much, yeah. But again, it's like so many of these. Like the
hmm
themes of these are universal, right?
yeah,
Like the other
exactly.
example, like the other one is the classic Ready Player One or whatever. Like a lot of, to me, the most interesting part of that concept or narrative is imagine a game where you're like you're forced to pick one of four cliched character archetypes. You're either the big blocky muscle guy or whatever, and you play the game limited to their choices and roles. But
hmm
then the simulation breaks, and now like all of the NPC dialogues is I like cat food or something. And it's like, I don't want to. So you get three choices that say, I like cat food, and then a text box. And so you're sort of telling the player, the simulation is broken. You have to take over from here. And
hmm
now you're giving them the choice of going, do I continue the story that I've built up with this character that I've built? Or do I want to say, help, I'm in the simulation, whatever. Like you, because now you're letting them build a narrative of like X is broken. And it goes back to the conflict. The conflict has happened. That is, the game you are playing has stopped playing the way it was previously playing. How do you wish to proceed? So it doesn't have to be one like solution, but it's the narrative. This is why I go back to the narrative. I don't care if you're playing Tetris. There's a narrative of you playing the game, and if you always lens it through the character playing, which is the player does this, then this happens. The if then before concept. It's like there's so much potential for that that always leads to like fun and compelling sort of stories and outcomes.
Right. Yeah, I think one of the very first things you said when you got on the call was like the point of a narrative is you set up the world as it is and then you change something.
Yeah, or
I mean,
break the
maybe not
status
the
quo.
point.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think there's a dichotomy of like you can use AI like within that, but it sounds like what you're describing is like that is. I mean, you break the status quo of now you can say what you want instead of like being within this world. I think there's a lot of
exactly.
probably
Yeah.
things you can use the AI as part of breaking that status quo versus like it just being a small. I mean, it's basically putting it front and center of like that is what's changing. Now you as the player have this story that you are experiencing.
And you also like when I say break the status quo, like it can actually be what's really cool about anything that you're developing is you set the starting guardrails. So I'll kind of I vaguely mentioned this whole VR idea and I think this is a good place to bring it up. Is let's take 2D Mario, right? Just the standard 2D Mario. You don't think about it, but they've set the universal rules that now from our world gravity exists, and so we think of it as like a default. But like in a game, there's nothing stopping you moving in both axes. You can move left, right, forward, and back. So the idea is, theoretically, Mario should be able to just like freely float and hover around the play space. The concept of gravity that limits his ability to just hover up to the top of the screen is a limitation. I have taken away an axis of movement from you, and I've set the universe rules such that that doesn't exist. There is no such thing as that axis from a free movement perspective. Which means when you introduce flying, yes, it's a cool power up. That's one way to look at it. The other way is I've just given you back the thing I took from you at the start of the story. I've given you back the y-axis, and the player is ecstatic. It's a cool free power up. It goes back to the World of Warcraft thing where they were tasked. I think it was legal actually. They had to require to put into their game something to disincentivize players from playing for large lengths of time. And so they ended up with a long play penalty. If you played for longer than like 8 hours or something, you would get a negative experience gain. People despised it. They ended up taking it out. Then they ended up adding a fresh sleep bonus, and you end up with if you've logged in within the last X number of hours, you get free extra experience. Now they just give you back normal experience, but from your perspective, you're now being rewarded for doing something rather than taking something away.
hmm
And so even just the simple psychology of that, which goes back to my original thesis, was when I was doing VR stuff. One idea I wanted to progress, and I never really took the time to do it, but I still think is like a really clever idea, is to have someone play effectively Snake on screen. 'Cause there was a big thing about horror games at the time. There's a bunch of horror games where you'd play a horror game, but the actual game would be you sitting on a couch looking at a television in VR,
I
and
played
then
some of
creepy
those.
stuff would happen in the house. Yeah, there's a bunch of those. Well, I think that's a cool idea. I think they missed the real potential of that story, which is imagine I'm sitting at my screen playing Snake on like an old CRT. And in classic like building game fashion, as I play the game, I earn points or whatever, and I spend the points to upgrade my TV, and I get like a large screen TV, and I can like, and it goes back to what I said: is you take away color, you give them the ability to buy a color TV. They get this ta-da wow factor, and you
Hmm.
keep doing that until they buy a VR television. Where the snakes on the screen fly out of the television and start spinning around them, and that would blow their goddamn mind. Because they're already sitting in a virtual space. You'd think that would be amazing. But if you reframe the narrative that no, this is the virtual world, that's the TV. Nothing in the TV ever comes out of the TV. That would be insane. But then you break that expectation, you get to like re-trigger that awe factor, which is kind of fascinating. So the more stuff that you can frame the narrative a certain way, you get the freedom to like treat it as a reward. So for me, it's not even just the like you can't speak, then you can speak. This goes back to the guard railing thing. Is that like you could do this with anything as simple as you're allowed to sell 3 of 5 different crops, and then maybe at a certain point in your farming journey, you unlock access to the like trade routes because you've built X, Y, and Z, and now you go in. There's a large list of stuff, but there's also a box that says, "Or type in what you're looking for." And so now
Hmm.
it's like framed not as you're modifying the game to whatever. It is the search engine for the online retailer that you're using now has more options available than even your local store did. Like, so again, it can be anything you like. It's just that whole device framing of this is the world, and then we're now introducing new stuff.
Yeah, and I think that also, I mean, it's not the point, but it also helps a lot with the progression that we were struggling with when you can just start with anything, and also the narrative. Um, Starting with a lot of those guardrails is probably a great idea, and taking that away is probably a wow factor for the player of they're like, oh,
Mm.
I can do whatever I want in this system that I've already invested time into, so I'm not going to just search penis. And yeah, I think talking it through, that's a great point to point out, and I think we will incorporate that. Yeah, we were
I
just
know I've been sort of monopolizing the conversation a bit, but as you can imagine, these are things that like I've been doing various aspects around this for years, specifically narrative in games, and I have, as you can imagine, many opinions.
yeah, no, for sure. My uh, background is a lot in writing, and I have a lot of really strong opinions about uh, how a lot of dialogue is written in books, and I haven't really brought that over into the game development world yet, but I've seen a lot of things and I'm like, oh, that's wrong. And I think it's
It
going to
is
be
it is so bad. It drives me so fuck. Like my God, I cannot express how like game writing is so behind, and not just behind vaguely, but like it's like the entire games industry right at the level of a kid in school learning how to write or fan fiction. It's like how it's like
well,
writers exist. This is so depressing.
yeah. I mean, you might have more experience in this, but from what I've seen, I mean, the smaller studios that I've seen don't even employ more than like one writer, if any. And the larger studios, I've seen some job descriptions of like how to get hired as a writer for game writing, and it's god awful pay because it's in game development, obviously. And there's no real requirements. So it's just kind of like
Yeah. There's also no prestige either. Like realistically, nobody
exactly.
is bragging about it, so there's not really a lot of incentive there either.
Yeah, if you can write, you're gonna write like a book or something that has your name on it. And I feel like a lot of, I mean, maybe this is blasphemous to writers, and I'm sorry, but a lot of the people that get into writing and game development, it feels like that sort of like I've always been told if you want to get hired in the game dev industry, start as a janitor or start as like anything to get your foot in the door. It doesn't feel like
Mm.
there's a lot of like long-term writers. I mean, there's some like there's some famous ones at Blizzard and some other ones that like they're known for their stories, but in general, like I mean, a lot of indie games have pretty good writing because people are like they're building a game to tell a story they're passionate about. But if you're hired on,
Yeah.
um, I mean, this is my opinion from the outside of I
No, no,
used to
you're
look at writer jobs and I always wanted to be in game development, so obviously I looked at some of those, but it doesn't seem the prestige is there, the requirements is not really there, and the pay is much lower than other writing, which is already really low.
No, it's nailed it. Yeah, it's pretty on point with that. The only other thing I would say is that while I do agree the writing quality is usually far vaster in indie games, the again slightly blasphemous, I guess people would hate me for this, but the truth is, a lot of writing in indie games is the pizza cutter problem. It's all edge and no point, right? It's just this like
Yeah,
super. It's just this emotional outpour with often very little like core structure understanding because it comes from people who see games as a very emotional medium and then want to engage with it, but don't have the restraint and structure of main storyline. So a
yeah.
lot of it is often very on the nose. Even good writing in games, or at least popular. Like one of my favorite game story structures is there's a guy Yoko Taro who does the Drakengard and the Nier franchise,
Hmm.
and the stories are very compelling and interesting. They're very he lots of interesting themes, and he sort of um, because he watches a lot of Western movies, he brings in a lot of stuff that resonates more with a Western audience than sort of the more cliched RPG, JRPG type stuff. And he likes a lot of the same kind of themes that I do in terms of like robots and future and identity and personality. Like we talked about Gestalt theory earlier. Like one of his games, the predominant character type is called a Gestalt, right? He's got all of the themes of stuff. But even though he's praised for his writing, he's done talks about how he comes up with his writing, and his writing, by his own admission, is he says, "I think of the saddest thing, and I find a way to get there." And like
Yeah.
it works, like it does narratively, structurally work, but it's one of those things that like if you're engaging with it on for what it is depressingly predictable and shallow. That if you know in any one of his stories, if a cute puppy gets introduced, you know shit's going down, right? Like
Right.
there's never going to be anything past that point because you know his entire like perspective on narrative comes from these sort of shallow beats, right? It's so yeah,
Hmm.
game narrative is a real killer for me because I really do feel like I think the pinnacle of game writing is going to be interactive narrative. It's going to be where you take part in the story and your choices are driven by it. But I think most games haven't even mastered just telling a story. You get people like David Cage who are trying, but cheat because rather than actually making a game, they just make a movie with extra steps, and so they
Right.
steal all of the structural tricks from movie telling, which again work, but like a good example of this, my friend was playing David Cage's game Heavy Rain, and I'd never played it. And I walked in and sat down, and he's like, "Oh, do you want to go?" And there was a scene where a character was in a there's a character in a bed, in a hospital bed, and there was a bunch of books of origami shapes, and like kind of like that little origami shape there.
Hmm.
And you're meant to turn the page to one of them and make the right character. Now, I sat down and I said this out loud to him. I said, okay, here's a book in front of me. Now, if I was a game designer, I'm not going to put the answer on the first page because there's
Right.
wasted opportunity for content there. I'm not going to put it in the last page. It'll tire out the player. Uh, Possible candidates, Magician's Choice wise, are two and three. Realistically, you probably want to give people one or two beats of failure because rule of three is good for narrative storytelling. It's
Hmm.
probably the third one. And
I
so I turned to
immediately
three, do
was
the
like,
thing.
it's probably third.
Yeah, and I get the right one. And he's just like, that's not how you're supposed to play this. I'm like, yes, but that's what he's doing.
Hmm.
Very clearly, I can tell this guy is more of a cinematic. He's telling a narrative, and so he's failing at the game portion because he's telling the story using story beats and not game beats. And it immediately ruins my ability to engage with it as a game because that's not how it's actually presented to me.
That reminds me of like answering standardized test questions when you don't know the answer. That's like
Yeah.
that's that kind of analysis. It's
Yeah.
really
And
funny to listen to you guys talk about the writing and dialogue, because that's something I don't have a lot of strong opinions on. And even when I play games, I don't typically pay a lot of attention to that, which is kind of funny. Um, like I interact with games in a really different way. I mentioned this game earlier, Jason, before you got here, but I'm curious, did you ever play Mass Effect?
Oh, Mass Effect is one of my favorite games. I've
Okay,
played all of
yeah,
them.
that's like one of my all-time favorite games. Like I thought the story in that game was so good that it actually made me pay attention to it. Um, yeah, it was
Like,
awesome.
I'll put it this way: this is how much I like Mass Effect. I joined Mass Effect 2. I
Hmm.
played through the game. I found out that the choices you make carry over.
Uh-huh.
So I
Yeah.
went back and played Mass Effect 1 so
Yeah,
I could
nice.
replay Mass Effect 2 so I could play Mass Effect 3.
You had to save Rex. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I love that game. I used to say that it should be taught in schools because the like philosophical questions in it were so interesting.
Well, the biggest philosophical question in that game, unfortunately, was me having to argue with people about the ending and how the entire media sphere painted any fan who was angry at the ending as being just annoyed at the writers and not understanding or not, and like, pedantically wanting their ending and not understanding the sheer depth of betrayal of a story that is built entirely on player choice being
Yeah,
boiled down to
well,
ABC.
the secret to never having that feeling is to never finish the third game, which is what I did.
Well, actually, I was a huge proponent of the, like, they put in a fourth ending and they put it in, and by their own admission, as almost spite to the audience. They were like, fine, if you want a different ending, here's the quote unquote bad ending. And they put in an ending where the humans just outright fail. The entire 3-act game series was a complete wash. None of it matters. And just like at the start of the first game, where you get a protean thing, a pedestal that like your character learns the history of the previous
Yeah,
races,
yeah,
there's another alien who sees a one that's a human. Now,
yeah,
they meant that as a joke, but to me, if that was the original ending, I would have been fucking ecstatic
yeah.
because
Crazy.
it's narrative through line. It's a perfectly sensible ending. It's not a because if you're going to not like think about what that says. It says, yes, our game has been about micro choices to build this cataclysmic ending, and you got that. But at the end of the day, you don't control the universe. You don't get to make the choice. The actual decision they were saying, the meta narrative around you don't get to pick the A, B, and C, is actually true if you didn't get to pick the A, B, and C. If the story just ended in a way of like, and then that's the way the story goes and the world
Hmm.
continues, people would feel betrayed. But what would be interesting is they feel betrayed in the sense of that they felt betrayed by the universe, not by the individual core descriptions of the game. If you give them meaningless choices, then that's the part that hurts. But if you
Hmm.
gave me an ending which was just like a, well, I'm sorry, but like, yes, congratulations, you were a space hero. You rallied people together. You fought across space and time or whatever, but you didn't win. That's just sometimes that happens. Like that is a perfectly good ending to me, and I was really happy with it. It's just it's the fact that the other ones were just so anemically boring is what killed me.
Yeah, it's I remember there were a lot of people so angry. So I never finished the third game on purpose because I loved games 1 and 2 so much.
One of the best responses ever is at the time, somebody sent a whole load of muffins to the studio, and they were painted the 3 colors, and said, "Don't worry, they're all the same flavor."
So I actually wish not this is not a game, but I wish I had never watched the last season of Game of Thrones for the same reason. Because it like
Yeah,
ruined the whole
that was
series for me.
terrible. I watched all of that too. Although it didn't ruin it for me that much because it was already trailing massively downhill in my opinion. And the worst part is it failed because it did exactly what I wanted it to. As meta as a statement as that
Yeah,
is.
yeah. Because the
Be-
series was built on it doing things that you didn't want. Like that's what
yeah.
you appreciated about it.
Well, it's more specifically the types of audience, right? So the book told the story the author wanted to tell. The TV show is driven by ratings. And the problem is certain characters like Peter Dinklage, who's just a fantastic actor, who really like killed the role, was infinitely more interesting as a character than he was meant to be. In fact, the original character in the book is this ghoulishly, horribly deformed character, and TV's never going to do that. They're going to have this roguish, good-looking guy as the character. And so they gave him more and more screen time, and that happened multiple times. And actually, if you track a lot of TV shows, that's been a running theme. For example, the character Spike in Buffy was meant to be written out in 2 episodes, but the fan reaction was so high, he was forced to. The writer was forced to keep him in for longer and longer, to the point he grew to despise the actor because he was being forced to write him into the story. Same thing happened in the show Supernatural with a bunch of characters. Like so the audience response is what's driving a lot of the decision making, and so you end up with people with stories that don't through line hold up because they weren't built to conclude narratively that arc I described. They instead are yes anding the audience's responses, and that leads to bad narrative.
Yeah, I feel like anytime you get that like serial narrative that you see on TV, especially like regardless of whether it's from ratings or not, but a lot of it is driven by ratings. It's hard to get that overall arc because every episode typically has to return to roughly similar to the status quo, and
Mm.
it is very driven from the audience and what they expect and catering to people who may have missed an episode. And I'm not a big fan of the TV format, even if I'm not a fan of the writing in TV formats, but I do love the
Well,
TV
that's why I like
shows.
British TV, right? Because British TV tends to be no holes barred. 10 episodes, you get what you get. We're not getting you anymore, and you end up with actually an arc story that
Yeah,
tends to be far more compelling.
I do like those. I did not watch any Game of Thrones, and I haven't played Mass Effect, but I will say that I loved the ending of Lost.
See, I hated the ending of Lost, so that's an interesting comparison.
It's one of those things that people watched and watched, and everybody hated the ending, and I watched it. I was like, that's unexpected, I guess. I dig it. It was kind of the whole show. You're trying to figure out what's going on. At the end, you're like, I still don't know what's going on. All right.
Well, my friend liked the ending too, and I think there's a compelling argument as to why the ending is fine. It comes down to the classic: what are you watching the show for?
Yeah.
There's a lot of shows around the same time. Another one being Prison Break, and there was that running joke that it's called Prison Break, and by season 4 they're breaking out of a fourth. By season 3 they're breaking into a prison. By season 4 they're breaking out of a fourth prison. It's like it's a bit ridiculous at this stage. Um, so if you're watching Lost as a character portrait, there was a lot of compelling characters who got a narrative arc. You got to see rise and falls of individual characters. Desmond is one of my personal favorites, but there was a lot of great characters in that story. But my problem isn't that a story, because even like I just said, I'm perfectly fine even in a game like Mass Effect, where despite making 500 micro choices and expecting them all to pay off in some cataclysmic way, telling me that none of my choices mattered, because I don't mind when a story actively doesn't resolve the way or want to, or even doesn't accept my choices. What I can't abide by though is when the story is either clearly being made up as they go along, where like there isn't a kind of cause and effect. If you want a really good example of this, there's a bunch of these terms like Chekhov's gun or lamp shading or various different things for writing of how they structure kind of key points in a story. And a lot of people don't notice these, but they kind of feel them. A good example of this, there was a great video essay by Folding Ideas talking about the failed Suicide Squad movie. And a good example of editing is early on in the movie, one of the characters has this plush toy that he explains is for his daughter, and he puts it into his jacket, and he's basically throughout the entire movie hugging it in his jacket as this thing, and it's not brought up again, but it's like you can visibly see a bulge in his jacket, and it's this whatever. And so anybody who knows Chekhov's gun is the idea that don't show a gun unless you're going to fire it. You're setting up an expectation for an audience. And so later on in the story, at some point, big dramatic events happen, and the character gets shot. And then the camera pans as he falls to the ground, and he reaches to his chest, and he reaches in, and he pulls out a giant wad of money. Because whatever editors was putting the movie together, clearly, because the movie went through multiple different edits and cuts and whatever, didn't understand the setup and payoff tie that they were going for there. And so even if you don't notice it physically, it just feels off when it would have been satisfying had it revealed the way obviously it should have. And I say this to say shows like Lost, historically, they'll say it themselves, were very much writing their fucking pants off as they went. They had absolutely no through line of what they were doing. They did at the start for some things, but the general idea was just what would be cool or what would be mysteries or whatever. And for people like me, who's like really noticing these Chekhov setups and seeing them actively be derailed, it's infuriating. There's like lots of ones people don't even realize. Like, do you remember the kid Wally?
Mm-hmm.
Wally was reading a book. It was about animals, and there was on the book there was a polar bear, and there was a bunch of different um, birds of different types. And in the story, you see a bunch of birds flying around, and there's the famous polar bear like character inside the show.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the really interesting thing about this is if you're playing the meta narrative and like following the stuff online, polar bear's fur is not actually white. It's mostly clear and it looks white through the nature of the fact that it's in snow. If you put a polar bear in a forest, it'll be vaguely greenly tinted because it'll reflect from the skin. And so the polar bear we see in Lost is bright white.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's a very passable, boring, not really big detail. But if you're a nerd and you notice the thing and you're like, that's an interesting point. And so you see a kid reading a book about polar bears, and you see a polar bear which looks exactly as a kid might imagine a polar bear would be. Also, the birds. Clearly, they were implying he's got some sort of psychic power, whatever. It's like, oh, that's really cool.
Right.
And then later on, you go to the island, and there's actually got real polar bears on the island for some reason. It's like, oh, so that again, like these little things, bit by bit, kept adding up as like, or the character of Sawyer was reading a book. He used to read books all the time, and the books would be nods to some kind of narrative. One of the most famous ones being there's a book called The Third Policeman, and it's the story of that is about a bunch of characters who they're like thieves who go to a small town and they try to steal from the small town, and a bunch of wacky events occur, and it turns out the whole thing is purgatory, and they're being forced into this loop of doing stupid stuff, and it's just an infinite loop. Now, that one did kind of pay off. It turned out to be
Right.
the actual solution they're going for. But like the whole show was peppered with these kinds of little beats, these things of like, what did that mean and what did this mean and how does this apply? And sometimes it lined up, but a lot of the time it just became a let's mystery this to the next thing. And so when you get to the end of all of this and the answer just becomes a hand wave of it is basically a religious allegory, it's like I don't mind if you want to do that, but don't set up actual setups with no payoffs.
Yeah.
That was like rage inducing.
Yeah. I do remember there were a lot of setups that did not pay off. Yeah, I think the worst example is probably the show Supernatural, which I loved, but every season you could tell they were just going wherever they wanted for the week, and it had nowhere that it was meant to go, and they'd resolved all the original stuff, so now it's
Mm-hmm.
just like, what are we gonna do now? All right, we'll do this. Oh no, there's another demon. Oh no, this guy's back.
That
And
is 100% Power Creep, the TV show. It was so
yeah,
funny.
I loved
Like,
it for the
and
longest time, and then I couldn't finish it.
it
So
jumped so many sharks.
a really, really silly example of that is Ancient Aliens. If you guys have ever watched that show,
Mm-mm.
because like
I've
season,
I've heard of it. Yeah, I've not watched it though.
yeah, so like season one is like, I mean, obviously it's a little silly and it's like fringe, but there's a lot of facts and stuff, and like it's a really well thought out thing, and everything's really connected. But then season one was so popular, they kept making new seasons. But it's like, so the rest of the seasons, they're just like interviewing archaeologists and trying to get them to say crazy things because the whole theory was discussed in season one. So the seasons after season one just become like totally crazy and off track for that reason.
Mhm. Yeah, and the worst part is, like, to your point about Supernatural, is that it was the first season is a good, tight, well-written show. The second season, even arguably, is pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
But so the reason that show went off the rails is exactly that. Like they had a story they were telling, and they sort of derailed because what was really and the worst part is they didn't have to do that. The entire premise of season one was Monster of the Week. It's almost antithetical. It was literally let's come up with a wacky excuse and status quo it by the end. And that actually worked because the overarching narrative was we're looking for a person and we're traveling across the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
It only becomes nonsense once you get to the stage of like in the first season they're fighting demons. In the second season they're like, oh, there's demons everywhere. By season 6 there's angels they're fighting. By fucking season 8 they're fighting the death himself. By after that they're fighting the concept of narrative. Literally they're fighting the concept of narrative. It's so stupid.
Yeah. Power Creep the Show is a good name for it.
Yeah. Yeah. So hey, I
Well,
guess it's not just games with bad writing, huh?
yeah, well, at least we know we can do better than some, and we've got a lot of great bad examples to learn from. And there's a lot of work to be done with LLMs to make sure that we
Hey,
are
after all of that,
doing
just
that
do all that.
hard arc.
Just do all the good stuff. There you go.
Yeah,
Just do the good stuff.
you
Don't do the
know,
bad stuff.
I mean, the whole writer's strike says surely we can't make good stories with AI, so
Well, if the last few Marvel movies I watched are anything to go by, it says maybe we can only make good stories with AI.
yeah. Well, maybe there's a good balance of giving AI to actual writers so they can write better stories.
Yeah. Oh, jokes aside, I do actually. There's a lot of interesting study into that too. Like why is writing and stuff gone bad for that? Well, and it's not even like bad writing. It's the classic like what happens in a world where you've got one short deadlines, two you're literally rewrite like the amount of stories of these multi-million-dollar movies where they're doing rewrites on set.
Yeah.
That's mind-boggling. And the other part of it too is you often get things which are either trending badly or they don't like the director or the current landscape of social stuff, meaning somebody gets themselves in trouble and you have to like pivot or whatever. You
Mhm.
end up with this scenario where like things have to be reshot, but there also is like a huge lead time to go back to the throughput conversation about decisions have to be made well in advance to be able to be sent to post processing teams to produce the VFX to go through the whole thing. Then a lot of the times you're recutting and re-editing shots that have already been made and have to like now fit them into the story. So now you've got a patchwork of pre-existing expensive shots that need to be justified in a narrative that's freshly being written that has nothing to do with the old narrative. So I don't even blame quote unquote writers for writing bad stuff. I blame that whole like the structural process that leads it there mostly.
Yeah, I think that that terrible environment that they're working in kind of makes it impossible to work well in. I agree with that.
Yeah, well, hey guys, this has been great. I will probably jump off here pretty soon so I can eat dinner. Um, but it's been awesome having you join us, Jason. Thanks for jumping in and sharing all your opinions and stuff. It's
Yeah, it's
really
good
nice,
fun.
and we'd love to have you continue like chiming in the Discord and stuff. It's really great to get your opinion on things.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll be around.
Yeah, I think it's about time for me to hop off as well. I've been on here for almost 4 hours now, so gotta plan some dinner as well. I'm excited to I'll probably prototype a little stuff over the week so we can not be coding boring stuff like movement and whatnot. But next week, we'll focus more on actual code again. This was a nice, fun brainstorming week. Lots of good talk. I definitely have a lot to think about, and maybe you'll be back next week for proper code. But thanks for joining us. I think it's just the three of us in the channel, so maybe I don't need to do the full-on send-off, but in case there's anybody else or you're watching it on YouTube later, this is Andrew and I are co-founders of Chroma Golem. We're a game studio just experimenting with AI in games, figuring out what's fun and what's not. If you are a game developer that is interested in any of that, we have a Discord in the description, and we would love to have you. And we stream every Tuesday. Um, so, fun times. But yeah, thanks, Jason. Um, I'll hop off now, and I'll see you guys on Discord.
Yeah, it was a
Okay.
pleasure. Oh, one last actual note for you as we're signing off. I'll just post it here in the Discord as a thing. I don't know if I've linked this before, but because we were talking vaguely about level design and architecture and stuff,
Mm-hmm.
here was a sample I think I may have mentioned this before, but I made a little thing on GitHub a while ago, and it's literally just a little 3D level in Unity. Um, so the main point originally was software architecture. I was explaining how I build systems and tie things together, because it's got like a character controller with the camera and first person stuff, and it's also got like raycasting and it's like doors and various stuff. But that's not the framing device for it though. Is I built these. I took a singular example of the concept of stairs and I started like breaking down like the architectural decisions from a level design perspective of just the simple idea of how many steps, how tall should the steps be, what do steps represent, how do you make steps that are compelling, what should you not do with steps, what is a landing width relative to steps, and there's actually a million conversations to be had just around the concept of steps. And I intend to at some stage do all of the other various cool things like windows we talked about or whatever. But because you said you were kind of interested in that idea, here is a unnecessarily big deep dive in just the concept of steps that you can look around it.
Yeah, look at this ominous hallway, real nice and thin. This looks really cool. I'm gonna have to check this out. I think I saw it once before, and I asked if you had a 2D version, but
Oh, that's
yeah.
right. Yeah, no, I haven't. Unfortunately, I haven't gotten to 2D yet. That's on my to-do list. Yeah.
I'll check out the 3D version. Obviously, the architecture makes a lot more sense in 3D. Um, and of course, if anybody wants to check that out, it's in our general chat, or here's the URL. Thanks for sharing that.
Right, I'll leave it to us. As I said, pleasure chatting, and catch you next time.
You too. See ya.
Cool. See you guys. Bye bye.
See ya.